On my wedding day, my father walked my younger sister down the aisle right in front of me. I stood frozen in my wedding gown as 500 guests watched my family humiliate me one last time. What my father did not know was that the stranger who stepped out of the pews to take his place held the deed to our entire family empire. Before I tell you how I foreclosed on my family, let me know where you are watching from right now. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your peace. The heavy oak doors of Greater Grace Fellowship stood closed in front of me. Behind them sat 500 of the most influential people in Atlanta. This was supposed to be my moment. I am Maya, 33 years old, and for my entire life I had been the invisible daughter. I was the reliable one who fixed the problems, paid the bills, and stayed quietly in the background while my younger sister Chloe soaked up the spotlight. But today was different. Today, I was marrying David, a brilliant civil rights attorney who loved me exactly as I was. I took a deep breath, letting the scent of fresh white roses calm my racing heart. My father, Pastor Marcus, was standing next to me in his custom-tailored suit. He was the charismatic leader of this megachurch, a man who preached about love and family values every Sunday to thousands of devoted followers. For a fleeting second, I thought we were finally going to share a genuine father-daughter moment. I reached out to loop my arm through his. Then the side door of the vestibule flew open. Chloe burst into the room, and my heart dropped into my stomach. She was not wearing the bridesmaid dress we had selected months ago. Instead, my sister was wearing a floor-length white lace gown with a sweeping train. It was undeniably a wedding dress. Her makeup was artfully smudged and she was sobbing hysterically. "Dad," she wailed, throwing herself against his chest. "Preston left me. He packed his bags last night and blocked my number. I cannot breathe, Dad, it hurts so much." Preston was her fiancé of 6 months. While a breakup is painful, the timing and the wardrobe choice were entirely calculated. Chloe had always possessed a terrifying talent for hijacking my milestones. When I graduated high school, she faked a panic attack, so my parents missed my valedictorian speech. When I bought my first car, she crashed hers the next day, demanding my parents buy her a better one. Now, on the day of my wedding, she had shown up in a bridal gown to ensure all eyes remained on her. I waited for my father to comfort her quickly and tell her to take a seat. I waited for him to remind her that this was my wedding day. Instead, he wrapped his arms tightly around her, ignoring me completely. "Oh, my sweet girl," he murmured, stroking her hair. "I am so sorry. Daddy is here. I have got you. Dad," I said softly, my voice trembling slightly. "The music is changing. It is time to walk." He looked up at me, and the annoyance in his eyes felt like a physical blow. "Maya, can you not see your sister is in agony right now? Have some compassion." I stared at him in disbelief. "I have compassion," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But the bridal chorus is playing. David is waiting at the altar. We need to go." My mother Diane, the esteemed first lady of our church, rushed into the vestibule. She took one look at the situation and immediately rushed to comfort Chloe, rubbing her back. "What happened to my baby?" she cooed. "Preston left her." My father explained, his tone thick with sorrow. "She is completely broken, Diane. We cannot just leave her here alone." "Then someone needs to sit with her in the front row," I said, my patience wearing thin. "Mom, you can sit with her. Dad needs to walk me down the aisle." My mother turned to me, her eyes narrowing with that familiar coldness. "Do not be so selfish, Maya. The heart of Chloe is shattered, and you are worrying about a schedule. She needs her father right now more than you do. You are a strong, independent woman. You can walk yourself." Before I could process the cruelty of her words, the heavy oak doors swung open. The entire congregation stood up, turning to look at the entrance. The flash of cameras illuminated the sanctuary. 500 guests were smiling, waiting to see the bride. My father did not hesitate. He tightened his grip on the arm of Chloe, holding her close to his side. "Keep your chin up, sweetie," he whispered to her. "Let them see how strong you are." Without a single glance back at me, Pastor Marcus stepped through the doors and began walking down the aisle. He was walking my sobbing white-clad sister down my wedding aisle. A collective gasp rippled through the massive sanctuary. The organist faltered, hitting a wrong note before frantically trying to recover the melody. I watched from the shadows of the vestibule, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of what was happening. My father was patting the hand of Chloe, comforting her as they walked slowly past the VIP pews, past the floral arrangements I had paid for, past the friends and colleagues who had come to celebrate my union with David. David stood at the altar, his handsome face shifting from joyous anticipation to absolute confusion, and then to a dark, brewing anger. He stepped forward as if to march down the aisle and drag me to the altar himself. I stood completely alone at the church entrance, my hands gripping my bouquet so tightly the thorns pressed through the silk ribbon. My mother stepped into my line of sight and blocked my view of the altar. Diane was a woman who valued appearances above all else. She wore her title of First Lady like a crown and treated her congregation like subjects. She grabbed my arm with surprising force. Her manicured nails dug sharply into my bare skin. I winced but refused to pull away. "Stop making that face," my mother hissed. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the sharp sting of a whip. "You are ruining the aesthetic of the entrance. Chloe is going through a devastating trauma right now. Preston leaving her is a public scandal for this family. She needs her father to stabilize her." I looked down at the hand gripping my arm, and then up into the cold eyes of my mother. "I am the bride," I said. My voice was eerily calm. "This is my wedding day. My father just abandoned me at the threshold of the sanctuary to walk a crying woman in a white dress down the aisle." "Oh, please," my mother scoffed. She finally released my arm and smoothed the front of her own expensive gown. "You are 33 years old, Maya. You have your own career, your own money, and your own apartment. You have always been the independent one, the strong one. You do not need a man to hold your hand to walk 20 yards. Chloe is delicate. She requires protection. Now fix your face, just walk down that aisle with your head held high, and do not embarrass this church in front of the mayor." The strong one. That was the label they had slapped on me since childhood to justify their neglect. Being the strong black woman in this family simply meant I was the workhorse. It meant my pain was invisible. It meant my resources were communal property while my needs were an inconvenience. When I paid off the credit card debt of my parents 5 years ago, they called me strong. When I organized the youth ministry galas by myself, they called me capable. They weaponized my resilience to excuse their blatant favoritism. "Well, look at you holding down the fort all by yourself." The voice came from my right. It was sweet, high-pitched, and dripping with condescension. I turned to see Sarah stepping out of the side corridor. She was the wife of my older brother, Marcus Jr. Sarah was a woman from a wealthy Connecticut family who loved playing the benevolent savior to her husband and his dramatic relatives. She adjusted the designer shawl draped over her shoulders and gave me a look of exaggerated pity. "I just saw Marcus walking poor Chloe down the aisle," Sarah said. She placed a cool hand on my shoulder. "That must be so incredibly embarrassing for you, Maya. But honestly, it makes total sense. You have always been so intimidating and self-sufficient. You never really needed a father figure the way Chloe does. You are practically a man when it comes to handling your emotions." I stared at her. The microaggression hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She was calling me masculine because I did not collapse into a puddle of tears. She was invalidating my right to be cherished on my wedding day because I paid my own bills like a responsible adult. "It is actually quite inspiring," Sarah continued. She was oblivious to the absolute ice in my stare. "Most brides would be having a complete meltdown right now. But you are just standing here taking it. I suppose you are used to doing things on your own. It is a very cultural thing, is it not? The independent matriarch carrying the burden alone. If I were you, I would just march down there and show everyone you do not need anyone." My brother Marcus Jr. peeked his head around the corner behind his wife. He looked at me, looked at our mother, and immediately ducked back out of sight. He was a coward who let his wife deliver the insults he was too afraid to say himself. "Listen to Sarah," my mother said. She checked her reflection in the glass of the vestibule doors. She understands the assignment. We have influential donors sitting in those pews, Maya. We have politicians who contribute to the expansion fund of the church. If you throw a tantrum right now, you will ruin the reputation of your father. Is that what you want? Do you want to destroy the ministry that put food on your table? I wanted to laugh. The ministry had not put food on my table in 15 years. I had funded my own college education. I had paid for this entire wedding down to the imported roses lining the pews. They thought they held leverage over me because they still believed I was just a mid-level financial advisor scraping by in a corporate cubicle. They believed I was truly desperate for their validation. I am not walking down the aisle alone, I stated. I kept my posture perfectly straight. I am not going to be the punchline to your pathetic family joke. You will do as I say, my mother snapped. The polite First Lady facade completely vanished. You will walk down there, you will smile for the cameras, and you will share this day with your sister. She needs the support of the congregation right now. You are going to be a good sister and share the spotlight. Share my wedding, I clarified. You want me to share my wedding with a woman who is actively trying to upstage me? Do not be petty, Maya Sarah chimed in. She stepped back and crossed her arms. It is just a walk. You are making this about your ego when Chloe is literally suffering a mental health crisis. You should be using your strength to uplift her. That is what a real Christian woman would do. I looked from Sarah to my mother, letting her ridiculous comment about being a real Christian woman hang in the air. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was breathtaking. I am not walking down that aisle alone, I repeated, my voice dropping an octave. I will stand right here until the organist gives up or the congregation leaves. If you want a public scandal, Mother, you are about to get a spectacular one. Diane stepped forward, raising her hand as if she might actually strike me right there in the church vestibule. You insolent little girl. She hissed, her face contorting with a rage she usually kept hidden behind her church lady hats. You will not disrespect this family. Before her hand could make any sudden movements, the heavy wooden doors separating the vestibule from the main sanctuary were pushed open further. The sudden influx of air caused the expensive pillar candles lining the back pews to flicker wildly. The low murmur of the confused congregation swelled into the small space we occupied. But it was not an usher coming to check on the delay. It was a guest. He emerged from the very first row of the VIP section. The man moved with a predatory grace that commanded immediate attention from everyone in the vicinity. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that radiated quiet, astronomical wealth. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, and his sharp, dark eyes swept over the pathetic scene in the vestibule with absolute authority. This was Victor Sterling. In Atlanta, the name Victor Sterling was spoken with a mixture of profound reverence and deep fear. He was a billionaire real estate mogul whose conglomerate owned half the commercial properties in the city. He was also the man whose venture capital firm operated ruthlessly in the shadows, acquiring massive amounts of distressed debt from failing enterprises. To my mother and sister-in-law, he was a titan of industry they could only dream of rubbing shoulders with at elite charity galas. To me, he was something entirely different. Victor ignored my mother completely. He did not even glance at Sarah, who had suddenly frozen in place, her mouth hanging slightly open as she recognized the billionaire standing inches away from us. He walked straight up to me, his expression softening into genuine warmth. He looked at my tightly clenched fists, the tension in my jaw, and the solitary stance I maintained against my own flesh and blood. Maya, he said, his deep baritone voice cutting effortlessly through the toxic air of the vestibule. I believe there has been a mistake in the itinerary. A queen never walks alone. He extended his right arm toward me. The diamond cufflinks on his sleeves caught the dim light of the entryway flashing brilliantly. He stood there offering the physical support and respect that my own family had just denied me without a second thought. My mother let out a strangled gasp. Mr. Sterling, she stammered, her perfectly rehearsed First Lady persona, scrambling desperately to recover. What an unexpected honor. We were just having a minor family disagreement. Maya was just about to walk down the aisle. You do not need to trouble yourself with this. Victor slowly turned his head to look at Diane. The warmth vanished from his face, instantly replaced by the freezing calculation of a corporate shark assessing a bad investment. "I am not troubling myself, Diane," he replied purposely, omitting her cherished church title. "I am escorting my most valued associate down the aisle." It seems her designated escort got distracted by a theatrical performance. Sarah shrank back against the wall. The condescending smirk was entirely wiped from her face. She recognized real power when she saw it, and Victor Sterling wielded more power in one hand than her entire trust fund family possessed in 3 generations. She cast her eyes to the floor, terrified of drawing his attention. I released a breath I did not know I was holding. I relaxed my grip on my bouquet and slipped my arm through his. "Thank you, Victor," I said softly. "It is my absolute privilege, Maya," he replied. He patted my hand, resting gently on his arm. "Shall we show them how it is done?" We stepped through the doors and into the blinding light of the sanctuary. The organist, who had been vamping nervously for the last 5 minutes, caught sight of us. He immediately transitioned into a soaring, triumphant rendition of the bridal march. The 500 guests stood up a second time. This time, the gasps echoing through the vaulted ceiling were not of confusion, but of pure, unadulterated shock. Murmurs ripped through the pews like wildfire. The influential politicians, wealthy donors, and church deacons leaned into the aisles, stretching their necks to get a better look. They all recognized the man walking me down the aisle. They knew Victor Sterling did not attend modest weddings, and he certainly did not escort mid-level financial advisors down the aisle. The power dynamic in the room shifted instantly. I was no longer the tragic abandoned bride. I was walking arm in arm with the financial king of Atlanta. Halfway down the long velvet runner, my father was still coddling Chloe. They had stopped moving forward, likely confused by the sudden change in the music and the renewed commotion behind them. Pastor Marcus turned around, his pastoral smile frozen on his face. He expected to see me trailing miserably behind them, accepting my place in the shadow of his favorite daughter. Instead, he saw Victor Sterling. I watched the exact moment my father realized who was holding my arm. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking ashen and suddenly very fragile. His grip on Chloe loosened drastically. He stumbled slightly, his polished leather shoes scraping loudly against the marble floor. He recognized Victor Sterling, not just as a famous billionaire, but as the man whose investment group held the massive secretive loans keeping this very mega-church afloat. Chloe, annoyed by the sudden loss of attention, yanked on his arm. "Dad, what are you doing?" she whined loudly enough for the front rows to hear. "Everyone is looking at her. Pay attention to me." For the first time in his life, Pastor Marcus did not cater to the tears of Chloe. He was completely paralyzed, staring wide-eyed at the man walking me toward the altar. Victor locked eyes with my father as we approached, his gaze unyielding and full of silent menace. My father swallowed hard sweat gathering on his brow. The man who loved to command the stage had been completely neutralized in his own sanctuary. We walked right past them. Victor did not spare my father a single nod of acknowledgement. He guided me smoothly around my gaping sister and my trembling father, leading me directly to the altar where David was waiting. David smiled, his anger melting away the moment he saw me safe and supported. He stepped forward to take my hand. Victor formally transferred my arm to David, giving my husband a firm, respectful nod of approval. "Take care of our girl, David." Victor said, his voice carrying just enough for my paralyzed father to hear. "She is the best investment I have ever made." Victor took his seat in the front row, right where my parents were supposed to sit. I turned to face David, blocking out the sight of my father dragging a furious, pouting Chloe into a side pew. The ceremony began, but the air in the church remained thick with electricity. The balance of power had shattered. My family thought they had successfully broken my spirit, but they had no idea that this walk down the aisle was just the beginning of their absolute financial and social destruction. The reception was held at the Grand Marquis Ballroom, a venue dripping with excess. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over tables draped in imported white silk. Towering centerpieces of white orchids commanded the center of every table. I had paid for every single blossom, every gold-rimmed plate, and every ounce of champagne flowing into the flutes. My parents had happily taken the credit naturally. They had spent months bragging to their congregation about the lavish wedding they were throwing. They conveniently omitted the fact that my credit card was the only one on file. When David and I made our grand entrance, the applause was thunderous but laced with frantic whispering. The scandal at the church had already spread through the ballroom. Guests were buzzing with questions they were too polite to ask. Why did Pastor Marcus walk Chloe down the aisle instead of the bride? Why did Victor Sterling, the most feared billionaire in Atlanta, step in to give Maya away? And why was Victor currently seated at the VIP table, while Pastor Marcus looked like a man marching toward execution? I kept my smile flawless as David led me to the sweetheart table. I refused to let my family see a single crack in my armor. Chloe was seated nearby at the main family table, visibly pouting. She had changed out of the bridal gown and into a slinky silver evening dress that was equally inappropriate. She sat slouched in her chair, dabbing at her dry eyes with a linen napkin, playing the role of the tragic, abandoned fiancé for anyone who would look her way. My father sat next to Chloe, dabbing his own forehead with a handkerchief. The commanding presence of Pastor Marcus was entirely gone. He kept stealing terrified glances toward Victor Sterling, his hands trembling slightly. My mother Diane, however, was a different story. The First Lady of Greater Grace Fellowship was vibrating with a toxic, suppressed rage. She shot me venomous glares across the ballroom, furious that I had defied her in the vestibule and embarrassed the family in front of the political elite of the city. That moment arrived when the catering staff cleared the dinner plates and the master of ceremonies announced the beginning of the toasts. The best man delivered a charming, funny speech that highlighted the unwavering integrity of David and our partnership. The maid of honor followed with a sweet tribute. Then the microphone was handed over to the family table. My mother stood up and walked slowly to the center of the dance floor. She gripped the microphone, wearing her signature expression of pious suffering. The ballroom fell completely silent. Everyone waited to hear how she would address the elephant in the room. "Praise the Lord, everyone!" My mother began, her voice echoing through the massive ballroom with practiced theatricality. "We are gathered here today to celebrate love. But as we all know, the devil is always busy. The devil loves to attack a righteous family when they are meant to be celebrating. My heart breaks today with a profound sorrow for the trials our family is currently enduring." She did not look at me. She did not look at David. She turned her entire body to face the family table where Chloe was sitting. "Many of you saw my beautiful youngest daughter, Chloe, crying at the church today." My mother continued, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "Last night, the enemy attacked her home. Her fiancé Preston walked out on her. He broke his sacred promises and left my sweet girl shattered. As a mother, my instinct is to protect my young. My instinct is to drop everything and hold my baby girl while she cries. We sacrifice our own moments of joy to bind up the brokenhearted." A low murmur rolled through the crowd. Even the most devout members of her congregation exchanged uncomfortable glances. Hijacking a wedding toast to turn it into a pity party for the sister of the bride was a new low even for Diane. "So before we raise our glasses to Maya and her new husband," my mother commanded, her voice rising into a preaching cadence, "I want to ask this entire room to bow their heads. I want everyone here to extend your hands toward Chloe. We are going to pray for her broken heart. We are going to pray that God restores her spirit and punishes those who brought this shame upon her." She closed her eyes and began praying loudly for Chloe right in the middle of my wedding reception. She prayed for 15 agonizing minutes. She asked God to bless Chloe with a better man and a luxurious home to replace the one she lost. Throughout the entire performance, she did not mention the name of David once. She did not congratulate us. She effectively turned my reception into a televised prayer vigil for the golden child. David leaned toward me, his voice a low, furious whisper. "I am going to stop this. I am going up there right now and taking that microphone out of her hand." I tightened my grip on his fingers, anchoring him to the seat. "No," I whispered back, keeping my serene smile locked in place. "Let her finish, David. Let everyone in this room see exactly who she is. She is digging her own grave. I glanced across the room toward the VIP section. Victor Sterling was leaning back in his chair watching the spectacle with a look of absolute disgust. He caught my eye and slowly, deliberately raised his crystal glass of bourbon in my direction. It was a silent salute acknowledging my restraint. My family thought they were humiliating me. They thought this public disrespect would force me back into submission. They did not realize that every word my mother spoke was adding another nail to the coffin of their fake empire. They had no idea that the trap was already set and waiting for them. The air at our sweetheart table grew frigid as Sarah descended upon us. She moved with the fluid grace of a social climber who had never known the sting of a rejection letter. She clutched a glass of vintage Pinot Noir in one hand and dangled a tiny designer clutch from her wrist. She did not bother to greet David. Her eyes were fixed entirely on me with a gaze that was meant to be empathetic but registered as utter contempt. "Oh, Maya," she cooed loud enough for the table surrounding us to hear. "I just had to come over and tell you how absolutely stunning you look today despite everything. It must be so incredibly difficult to put on a smile for 500 people while knowing your credit rating is plummeting in real time." I continued to cut into my filet mignon, my knife moving with surgical precision. David had gone rigid beside me. He was a litigator by trade and he lived for these moments of verbal sparring, but I nudged his ankle under the table. This was my theater. Sarah did not wait for an invitation to invade our space. She leaned over the table, her perfume a cloying mix of jasmine and pretension. I was talking to Diane earlier and she mentioned how worried she is about the final catering bill for this bash. It is frankly a mountain of debt for someone in your position. I mean, being a financial advisor is a steady job, but these venues require so much upfront capital. I know the struggle of keeping up appearances in a city like this. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small gold pen. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper meant for anyone within a 10-foot radius. "I know we have not always been the closest sisters-in-law, but I simply cannot bear to see you suffer this kind of financial humiliation in front of the mayor. I have a private line of credit with a very discreet firm. If you need a temporary bridge loan to cover the lobster tails and the open bar, just say the word. I would be happy to help you avoid the shame of a declined transaction at the register." David opened his mouth, his patience having reached its absolute limit. I could feel the sharp retort on his tongue. He was about to tell her that I had paid for this entire event in cash 6 months ago. He was about to tell her that my net worth dwarfed their combined family assets. I cut him off before he could utter a syllable. I looked up at Sarah and tilted my head just enough to catch the light. I let a slow, pitying smile spread across my face. "Sarah, that is such an incredibly thoughtful offer. Truly, I never imagined you were so concerned about my fiscal health. It really warms my heart to see you looking out for my bottom line when you have so many pressing financial fires of your own to put out." Sarah stiffened. The wine in her glass trembled slightly. "What on earth are you talking about?" she asked, her voice losing its melodic quality. I kept my voice low, gentle, and perfectly audible to the surrounding tables. "I am just a financial advisor after all, so I keep an eye on the market. I happen to notice that the luxury development group your husband represents just filed a notice of default on the Buckhead property project. It must be incredibly stressful to worry about a $20 million liability while planning your own summer retreat. I would hate for you to be humiliated if that project goes under. But I suppose you have been keeping a very brave face, just like I am supposed to be doing right now." The color vanished from Sarah's face. She looked as though she had been struck in the stomach. The arrogance that usually defined her posture withered instantly. She glanced around the room, terrified that the guests at the neighboring tables had heard the details of her husband's crumbling real estate deal. "How do you know about that?" she hissed, her voice barely a breath of air. I took a slow sip of my wine and shrugged. "I keep a close watch on the industry. It is part of the job. But please do not worry about me, Sarah. I have plenty of capital to cover the lobster tails. I would hate for you to spread yourself too thin by offering loans you cannot afford. Maybe you should focus on that default notice." It would be such a shame if the public found out about that before your husband has a chance to announce his bankruptcy. Sarah stood there for a heartbeat longer, her hand still holding the gold pen. She looked like she wanted to pour the Pinot Noir over my head, but the presence of Victor Sterling at the VIP table held her back. If she caused a scene with a billionaire's protégé, she would be socially dead in Atlanta before the cake was even cut. She retracted the pen and shoved it back into her clutch with a shaky hand. "You have always been bitter, Maya," she managed to spit out, though her voice lacked any real bite. "That is why you are all alone." I laughed, a low melodic sound that genuinely amused me. "I am not alone, Sarah. I am surrounded by people who support me. You are just standing there watching your life fall apart. And by the way, the lobster was delicious. You should have had some while you still could afford the plate." Sarah turned on her heel and retreated toward the bar, her composure completely shredded. David exhaled a long breath of air and grabbed my hand under the table. "You are terrifying when you are calm," he murmured with a grin. "I am not terrifying, David," I replied, watching my mother hover near the microphone getting ready for her 15-minute prayer session. "I am just finally done being the invisible one. I am done being the background noise in their symphony of lies. Now it is time to see who is actually listening." Sarah stumbled as she navigated the narrow space between the crowded banquet tables. The effortless glide she had perfected over years of country club galas was completely gone. She bumped hard into a waiter carrying a heavy silver tray of empty champagne flutes, causing a loud clatter that immediately drew the eyes of several prominent church elders. Sarah did not pause to apologize to the young man. She kept her head down, her knuckles stark white as she gripped her designer clutch. I watched her from the sweetheart table, sipping my champagne with deliberate slowness. The vintage bubbles danced on my tongue, matching the electric thrill of finally fighting back. Beside me, David adjusted his posture. He leaned closer, his shoulder brushing mine. "You bought their debt," he stated. It was not a question. David knew exactly what my venture capital firm did. He knew we acquired distressed assets and foreclosed on over-leveraged commercial and residential properties. But he had not realized I had crossed the boundary into my own family tree. "I did not buy it," I corrected him, keeping my voice steady and pleasant. "Sterling Capital bought it." Victor flagged the Buckhead portfolio 3 weeks ago during a routine acquisition meeting. Marcus Jr. and Sarah took out a massive second mortgage to fund their lavish lifestyle, and when the luxury development project tanked, they stopped making payments altogether. The bank was quietly trying to offload the toxic asset before it became public knowledge and ruined their social standing. Victor knew I would want first right of refusal. So yes, our firm now holds the deed to their fake empire. David let out a low whistle. A rare predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. He looked across the room to where Sarah had just collapsed into her seat at the main family table. "You did not just decline her fake loan, Maya. You essentially handed her an eviction notice at our wedding reception." I set my glass down on the crisp white linen. "I am just returning the energy they have given me for 33 years. Sarah thought she could walk over here and use her white tears and generational wealth to put the black sheep back in her place. She thought she could publicly humiliate me regarding the cost of my own wedding. I merely reminded her that her generational wealth is currently drowning in a sea of red ink." At the family table, the panic was becoming visible to anyone paying close attention. Sarah grabbed the arm of my older brother, Marcus Jr. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug deeply into the fabric of his tailored suit. She was whispering frantically into his ear, her face flushed crimson and her eyes darting repeatedly in my direction. Marcus Jr. frowned at first, swatting her hand away, as if she were a persistent nuisance. He was too busy enjoying the VIP treatment and the expensive catering to care about his wife having a sudden meltdown. But then Sarah leaned closer and said something that made the color drain entirely from his face. Marcus Jr. dropped his heavy silver fork. It hit the fine china plate with a sharp, piercing crack. He stared at Sarah, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocated fish. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of sheer terror and absolute disbelief. The arrogant alpha male persona he adopted whenever he was around our father completely evaporated. In that single moment, he looked exactly like the terrified little boy who used to hide behind my back when our parents yelled. Chloe, who was seated on the other side of Marcus Jr., noticed the disruption. She glared at Sarah, clearly irritated that someone else was drawing attention away from her fabricated heartbreak. Chloe huffed loudly, crossing her arms and dramatically turning her back to them. She leaned heavily against our father, expecting him to stroke her hair and offer more words of blind comfort. But Pastor Marcus was distracted. He had noticed the frantic exchange between Marcus Jr. and Sarah. A man who built a lucrative empire on manipulating the emotions of thousands of people possessed a finely tuned radar for genuine panic. He sensed the sudden violent shift in the atmospheric pressure of his carefully controlled family table. He watched Marcus Jr. run a shaking hand over his face. He watched Sarah grab her wineglass and drain it in one desperate, unladylike gulp. My father narrowed his eyes and followed their terrified gazes directly across the room to me. I did not look away. I held his stare across the vast expanse of the grand ballroom. For decades, I had been the one to look down. I had been the one to apologize for things I did not do simply to keep the artificial peace in our household. I had been the one to absorb their insults, their constant financial demands, and their casual cruelty. Not today. I lifted my chin and met the furious glare of my father with absolute unyielding calm. Pastor Marcus stood up abruptly. The scraping of his heavy chair against the polished hardwood floor was audible even over the light jazz playing through the premium sound system. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket, his jaw set in a hard, rigid line. He was shifting seamlessly into his authoritative pastor mode, preparing to deliver a righteous public scolding to the rebellious daughter who dared to upset the delicate balance of his family image. "He thinks you insulted Sarah." David noted, his voice dropping to a serious legal cadence. "He thinks you are just being petty and making his daughter-in-law cry for no reason. He is coming over here to put you in your place and demand an apology." "Let him come," I replied softly. I folded my hands perfectly in my lap. I felt absolutely no fear. The little girl who used to crave the approval and love of Pastor Marcus was dead. She had been buried the moment he chose to walk Chloe down the aisle instead of me. The woman sitting beside David was a seasoned executive who negotiated with corporate sharks on a daily basis. My father was just a big fish in a very small pond, and he was swimming straight into a steel net. David unbuttoned his own jacket and sat up taller. His presence beside me was a solid, unbreakable wall of support. He was a brilliant civil litigator, a man who systematically dismantled hostile witnesses for a living. He had watched my family disrespect me for the last 3 years, and he had patiently waited for my permission to strike back. "You handle the corporate executions," David said, his eyes locking onto the approaching figure of my father. "Let me handle the pastoral disputes. I have been saving a very special piece of evidence just for him." I turned to look at my husband, feeling a sudden surge of profound affection. "What did you do, David?" David reached into the inner pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a single neatly folded sheet of paper. It bore the unmistakable official watermark of a major banking institution. "Let us just say I did some independent discovery during our engagement," he murmured. "Your family loves to demand financial transparency from you, Maya. I thought it was only fair to apply that exact same standard to the church outreach fund." Pastor Marcus was halfway across the dance floor. His stride was long and purposeful, radiating a toxic mix of parental disappointment and religious authority. He was completely unaware that he was marching toward a legal and financial ambush that would tear down the very foundation of his hypocritical ministry. I took another sip of my champagne, savoring the crisp finish. The real reception was finally beginning. Pastor Marcus reached our sweetheart table with the momentum of a freight train. He did not bother with a polite greeting or a fatherly smile. He slammed both of his heavy hands flat onto the pristine white tablecloth. The crystal champagne flutes rattled precariously. He leaned forward, invading our space until I could smell the strong peppermint mints he chewed before every sermon. "Maya, what is wrong with you?" he demanded. His voice was a harsh, raspy whisper designed to project authority without alerting the guests at the nearby tables. This is your wedding day, and you are over here acting like a bitter child. Sarah just ran back to the family table in tears. I do not know what vicious lies you just whispered to her, but you are going to march over there and apologize immediately. You will not disrespect your sister-in-law and ruin the spirit of this celebration. I looked up at him. The absolute audacity of this man was staggering. He had publicly abandoned me at the church entrance to coddle my younger sister. He had allowed my mother to turn my reception into a prayer vigil for that same sister. Now he was demanding I apologize to a woman who had just insulted my financial independence to my face. I am not apologizing to anyone, Father, I said. My voice remained perfectly modulated. If Sarah is crying, she is crying over the consequences of her own financial mismanagement. I simply offered her a reality check. Pastor Marcus scoffed. His face darkened with that familiar authoritarian rage. You think because you wear a white dress today you suddenly run this family. You are out of line, Maya. You are acting out because you are jealous of the grace we extend to Chloe. You have always been jealous. Now get up and fix this before I have to intervene and discipline you myself. Before I could even formulate a response, David pushed his chair back. The scrape of the wooden legs against the floor sounded like a starting pistol. David stood up slowly, deliberately towering over my father. At 6'2", with the broad shoulders of a former college athlete, David was physically intimidating. But it was his icy professional demeanor that made him truly dangerous. You will not intervene in anything, Marcus David said. He did not call him pastor, he did not call him sir. The omission of the title was a direct, calculated insult. And you certainly will not speak to my wife in that tone ever again. My father straightened up instinctively, puffing out his chest. He was not used to being challenged by younger men. Now listen here, David. He started pointing a thick finger at my husband. This is family business. You might have married her today, but I am the head of this family. I decide how we handle disrespect. David did not blink. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and withdrew the folded sheet of paper he had shown me moments earlier. He smoothed it out with maddening slowness, placing it face up on the table right between the large hands of my father. Since we are discussing family business, let us discuss your accounting practices, David said. His voice dropped to the smooth, lethal cadence he used during cross-examinations. I am a very thorough man, Marcus. When I asked Maya to marry me, I decided to ensure her family was not hiding any liabilities that could negatively impact our future. I did a deep dive into the public tax filings of Greater Grace Fellowship. My father looked down at the paper. For a second, his eyes failed to comprehend the rows of numbers and dates. Then the realization hit him. The aggressive red flush in his cheeks instantly drained away, leaving his skin a sickly grayish hue. That document, David continued tapping a specific highlighted row, is a highly confidential wire transfer log. It shows that exactly 2 months ago, $50,000 was moved from the Greater Grace Youth Outreach Fund. That is a tax-exempt charitable account funded by the donations of your working-class congregation. Those funds are legally designated for community after-school programs. My father swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously. I can explain that he stammered, his voice suddenly lacking all its booming theatrical power. It was a clerical error, a temporary reallocation of funds for a church-related expense. A clerical error, David repeated. He leaned forward, mirroring the aggressive posture my father had used just moments ago. That is fascinating, because the receiving account for that $50,000 transfer belongs to your youngest daughter, Chloe. And strangely enough, the dates of that transfer align perfectly with her 2-week luxury shopping trip to Paris with her now absent fiancé. Did Chloe purchase $50,000 worth of Bibles in Paris, Marcus? I sat perfectly still, absorbing the magnitude of the revelation. $50,000. My father had stolen donation money from his own church to fund a European vacation for his golden child. While I was working 80-hour weeks to build my firm and paying for my own wedding, he was embezzling charity funds to buy designer handbags for Chloe. You have no right to look into church finances, my father hissed. He glanced around the ballroom, terrified that someone might overhear. You stole private documents. I am a civil rights attorney who specializes in corporate fraud, David replied with a chilling smile. I do not steal documents. I subpoena them. I have friends in the State Oversight Board who found the discrepancies in your tax-exempt filings highly concerning. They were more than happy to share their preliminary findings with me. My father gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turned white. He was a man cornered by his own hubris. He realized he was no longer talking to an intimidated son-in-law. He was negotiating with a legal shark who had him dead to rights. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was trembling now, stripped of all its fake righteousness. David looked down at him with absolute disgust. "I want you to step back from this table. I want you to return to your seat and keep your mouth shut for the rest of this evening. You will not demand apologies from my wife. You will not raise your voice to her. You will sit there and you will watch her enjoy the reception she paid for. And if I do not," my father challenged, though it was a weak, pathetic attempt to salvage his pride. "If you do not," David said, his voice razor sharp, "I will walk over to the VIP table right now. I will hand this bank statement directly to the mayor and the 3 church deacons sitting beside him. I will explain exactly how their generous donations are funding the designer wardrobe of your youngest daughter. I imagine the fraud investigation would be swift and highly publicized. You would be looking at federal wire fraud charges, Marcus. You would lose the church, the cars, the house, and your freedom." The silence that followed was absolute. My father stared at the bank statement, then up at David. The realization of his complete defeat washed over him. The powerful Pastor Marcus was reduced to a frightened old man caught in a web of his own greed and favoritism. He had spent his entire life manipulating his congregation and his family, but he had finally crossed the wrong man. My father slowly pulled his hands off the table. He did not say another word. He turned around and began the long, humiliating walk back to the family table. His shoulders were slumped and his head was bowed. He looked nothing like the arrogant patriarch who had marched over here just minutes ago. David picked up the bank statement, folded it neatly, and tucked it back into his jacket. He sat back down beside me and picked up his champagne flute. I looked at my husband, my heart swelling with an overwhelming sense of vindication. "You are incredible," I told him. David smiled and clinked his glass against mine. "I told you I would handle the pastoral disputes," he replied. "Now let us get back to enjoying our party. The night is still young, and your family has a lot more losing to do." The clink of fine crystal and the low hum of elegant jazz masked the absolute destruction that had just occurred at the family table. I watched my father sink heavily into his chair. He stared blankly at his untouched plate of food. Beside him, Sarah remained frozen in a state of catatonic shock. She was clutching her napkin as if it were a life preserver. My mother Diane leaned over and whispered frantically to my father, but he simply shook his head and waved her away. The mighty Pastor Marcus had been thoroughly neutered. For the next hour, David and I actually managed to enjoy our own wedding reception. We greeted our friends, laughed with former college roommates, and danced under the shimmering glow of the crystal chandeliers. I felt an incredible weight lifting off my shoulders. The toxic fog that had suffocated me for 33 years was finally dissipating. We were completely ignoring the dark cloud hovering over the family table. Then the master of ceremonies announced the cutting of the cake. It was a magnificent 5-tier confection, decorated with cascading edible gold leaf and white sugar orchids. The catering staff wheeled it into the center of the dance floor, positioning it perfectly beneath a spotlight. The photographer directed David and me to stand behind the elegant display. The crowd gathered around us, forming a wide circle of smiling faces and flashing cameras. I placed my hand over the hand of David, grasping the silver cake knife. For a brief, shining moment, I thought we had successfully navigated the worst of the evening. I should have known better. I should have known that a golden child deprived of attention is more dangerous than a cornered animal. Chloe had spent the last hour watching her support system collapse. She had seen Sarah retreat in humiliation. She had seen our father return to the table completely broken. She realized that the protective shield she had relied on her entire life was suddenly gone. More importantly, she realized that the 500 guests were no longer looking at her. They were looking at me, They were celebrating me. The spotlight had shifted back to the bride, and for Chloe, that was an intolerable offense. Just as David and I applied pressure to the silver knife, the sound system let out a sharp, piercing screech of feedback. The guests winced and covered their ears. I looked up and saw Chloe standing next to the DJ booth. She had muscled her way past the sound technician and ripped the wireless microphone from its stand. She stood there, breathing heavily, her silver evening gown glittering under the ambient lights. Her face was a mask of manufactured tragedy. Her makeup was expertly smudged to convey maximum distress without actually making her look unattractive. "I am so sorry to interrupt," she began. Her voice trembled perfectly, echoing through the massive speakers and completely shattering the joy of the cake-cutting ceremony. "I know this is the special day of my sister. I know I am supposed to be celebrating Maya, but I just cannot hold this inside anymore. The pain is literally killing me." The guests exchanged alarmed glances. The photographer slowly lowered his camera. David tightened his grip on my waist, his jaw clenching. He leaned in and whispered that she was entirely predictable. I did not move a single muscle. I stood there beside my beautiful wedding cake and watched my younger sister execute the most desperate theatrical performance of her life. Chloe gripped the microphone with both hands, pulling it close to her mouth so every shaky breath was amplified. "Everyone here knows that Preston left me last night," she continued, her voice cracked with practiced precision. "My mother told you all about my broken heart during the toasts. I have been sitting at that table trying to be strong. I have been trying to smile and support Maya. But the truth is, I am completely terrified. I am standing here tonight with nothing. Preston did not just break off our engagement. He destroyed my entire future." She paused, letting a single solitary tear roll down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, a gesture so delicate it belonged in a daytime soap opera. The older women in the congregation, the ones who had worshipped our father for decades, let out soft murmurs of sympathy. Chloe heard them and leaned directly into the pity. "When Preston packed his bags, he canceled the lease on the luxury apartment we were supposed to move into next week," she cried out, her voice rising in a crescendo of panic. "I have nowhere to go. I have no home, but that is not even the worst part. That is not why I am standing here begging for the prayers of this church family." She looked directly at me. Her eyes were hard and cold behind the curtain of fake tears. She locked onto my gaze, issuing a silent challenge before delivering her final devastating blow to the crowd. "I am pregnant," she wailed. The words hit the ballroom like a physical shockwave. A collective gasp erupted from the 500 guests. Some of the church elders clutched their pearls. "I found out yesterday morning," Chloe continued, her voice breaking into loud theatrical sobs. "I am carrying the child of Preston. I am going to be a single mother. I am pregnant and I am entirely homeless. I have no money. I have nowhere to lay my head. I do not know how I am going to survive this." The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. The sympathetic murmurs escalated into loud vocal outcries of support and pity. Several women from the church choir rushed forward, surrounding Chloe and offering her tissues and comforting embraces. My mother Diane immediately capitalized on the moment. She sprinted across the dance floor, pushing through the crowd to wrap her arms around her weeping daughter. She shot me a look of pure, triumphant venom. The narrative had been successfully stolen back. The golden child was once again the supreme victim and the absolute center of the universe. David looked at me, his eyes wide with utter disbelief. He was a seasoned attorney who dealt with chronic liars daily, but even he was stunned by the sheer magnitude of this fabrication. "She is not pregnant," David whispered to me. "There is absolutely no way she is pregnant. We both know she had a couple of glasses of champagne at the family table not an hour ago." "I know," I replied, my voice as cold as ice. "She is using the ultimate trump card to extort sympathy and resources. She thinks dropping the pregnancy bomb makes her untouchable. She thinks it gives my parents the ultimate leverage to force my hand." As my mother held Chloe, the crowd parted slightly to allow Pastor Marcus to join them. My father, having seemingly recovered a fraction of his courage under the guise of protecting his pregnant daughter, wrapped his arms around both of them. It was a picture-perfect tableau of a loving, deeply religious family rallying around a fallen sister. And it was completely fake. I watched them perform for the crowd, knowing exactly what their next move would be. They were going to use this fabricated pregnancy to demand something outrageous from me, right in front of everyone. They were going to weaponize the pity of the crowd to corner me. I placed the silver cake knife gently on the table, waiting for them to make their fatal mistake. The crowd of 500 guests watched with bated breath as my parents turned their unified front toward the sweetheart table. Pastor Marcus placed a heavy, comforting hand on the shoulder of Chloe, guiding her through the parted sea of church elders and wealthy donors. My mother Diane walked on her other side, her face set in an expression of pious determination. They moved with the synchronized precision of a military strike force, wrapped in Sunday morning self-righteousness. I did not reach for the cake knife again. I simply stood beside my husband, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. David shifted his stance, his body angling slightly to shield me. The murmurs in the ballroom died down entirely. The silence became so absolute that the rustle of the silk dress Chloe wore sounded incredibly loud. My father stopped a few feet away from us. He looked at me with a gaze that tried to project fatherly authority, but I could see the desperate calculation hiding behind his eyes. He knew he was financially compromised, but he still believed he held the ultimate emotional leverage in this room. He raised his voice, ensuring that the mayor, the deacons, and the wealthy investors in the VIP section could hear every single syllable. Maya. My father began, his tone dripping with thick, manufactured sorrow. The Lord works in mysterious ways. He tests us on our most joyous days to see if our hearts are truly aligned with His teachings. Today is your wedding day, a day of abundance and blessings. But your sister is standing here stripped of everything. She is carrying a new life, a fragile blessing that requires immediate protection. I maintained a perfectly blank expression. I am listening, Marcus, I said. I deliberately refused to call him Dad. My mother stepped forward. Her eyes darted toward the VIP tables, soaking up the sympathetic stares of her congregation before locking onto me. Maya. You have always been so resourceful, Diane said. Her voice was loud, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. You have a good job. You have David now. You two are a dual-income household. Chloe has nothing. She has no job, no fiancé, and now no home. As her older sister, it is your Christian duty to step up and provide the sanctuary she desperately needs. I tilted my head slightly. And what exactly does that sanctuary look like, Diane? What is the precise Christian duty you are demanding from me on the night of my wedding? Chloe sniffled, wiping her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated entitlement. Your penthouse. Maya? She whined, her voice trembling just enough to sound pathetic. The one in Midtown with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the private elevator? You and David do not need all that space now that you are married. You guys can just get a modest starter home in the suburbs. I need the security of a luxury building with a doorman for the baby. It is the only safe place for me after what Preston did. A collective gasp swept through the section of the ballroom where my friends and corporate colleagues were seated. They understood the sheer insanity of what was being proposed. My family was publicly demanding my primary residence. My father seized the moment, stepping closer. He used his best pulpit voice, the one that usually commanded thousands of dollars in tithes. It makes perfect sense, Maya. You are just renting that penthouse anyway. You can simply transfer the lease into the name of Chloe and continue paying the monthly rent until she gets back on her feet. It is a small sacrifice. You and David have good credit. You can easily find a decent little apartment by the end of the week. Give your sister the keys tonight. Show this congregation what true sisterly love looks like. I stared at them. The sheer staggering magnitude of their audacity was almost admirable. They were standing in front of 500 people actively attempting to extort my marital home to subsidize the fabricated lifestyle of their golden child. They believed I was just a mid-level employee renting a high-end property far beyond my means. They truly thought they could shame me into paying luxury rent for a sister who had never worked a hard day in her entire life. David let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He stepped slightly in front of me, his eyes blazing with furious disbelief. You want my wife to surrender her home tonight. You want us to pack our bags on our wedding night break, a lease you think she holds, and hand over the keys so your daughter can play wealthy single mother in a high-rise. My mother glared at David, her First Lady persona slipping to reveal the bitter controlling matriarch underneath. "Keep out of this, David," she snapped. "This is a family matter. Maya knows how this family operates. The strong must carry the weak. The blessed must shelter the broken. If Maya refuses to do this small thing for her pregnant sister, she is proving to everyone in this room that she is exactly the selfish, bitter spinster we always feared she would become." I placed my hand gently on the chest of David, feeling the rapid thud of his furious heart. I stepped past him, closing the distance between myself and my family. I looked directly into the eyes of Chloe. The fake tears had stopped. She was staring back at me with a smug, victorious glint. She honestly believed she had won. She thought the public pressure of the mega-church congregation would force me to hand over the keys to a multi-million-dollar property without a single question. "Let me make sure I understand this perfectly," I said. My voice was calm, crisp, and carried to the furthest corners of the quiet ballroom. "You want me to give up my home? You want me to continue paying for a luxury downtown penthouse so Chloe can live there for free? You are using the excuse of a sudden pregnancy to demand my property right in front of the mayor, the deacons, and my husband. It is what Jesus would do," my father declared, crossing his arms over his chest. "If you turn your back on your own flesh and blood, Maya, you will be turning your back on God. I will not have a daughter who lacks basic human decency. You will hand over those keys, or you will no longer be welcome in our church or our family." I let the threat hang in the air. I let the entire room absorb the absolute extortion my father was attempting to execute. The wealthy donors at the front tables were whispering frantically to one another. The church elders looked deeply uncomfortable witnessing their spiritual leader behave like a common street thug. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an executioner who had just been handed the signed warrant. "I am not giving my home to Chloe," I stated clearly and deliberately. "I will not be handing over any keys tonight or any other night. I will not be financing the delusions of grandeur you have fed her since she was a child. Your demand is not just completely absurd. It is the final profound mistake you will ever make regarding my finances." My mother gasped, pressing a dramatic hand to her chest in feigned horror. Pastor Marcus turned an alarming shade of red with indignation, preparing to unleash a torrent of religious condemnation. But they were completely out of time. The trap was fully sprung, and I was finally ready to pull the heavy lever. The silence in the ballroom shattered as my father let out a sound that was half gasp and half roar. He stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. The polished veneer of the compassionate megachurch leader burned away in a fraction of a second, revealing the tyrant underneath. "How dare you speak to your parents with such demonic arrogance?" he bellowed. His voice thundered across the room, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. "You are standing in the presence of God, and this congregation denying your own flesh and blood in her hour of deepest need." I did not flinch. "You are invoking God to steal my real estate, Marcus. I think we both know which one of us is committing a sin right now." My mother let out a loud, dramatic wail. She threw her hands in the air and looked toward the ceiling. "Lord, forgive this rebellious child. She is blinded by the love of money. She is hoarding her worldly possessions while her sister suffers. The devil has surely taken hold of her heart." Chloe clung to the arm of my mother, sobbing loudly into her hands, but I could see her dark eyes peering through her fingers, watching to see if I would crack under the pressure. This was their classic playbook. Isolate, guilt-trip, and threaten until I surrendered my resources to maintain the illusion of family peace. My father grabbed a microphone from a nearby stand. He turned his back to me and faced the 500 guests, transforming my wedding reception into a makeshift Sunday service of condemnation. "Look at the greed that corrupts the modern woman," he preached, pacing across the dance floor. "We raise them in the church. We teach them the values of charity and family. And the moment they get a little corporate paycheck, they turn their backs on the very people who gave them life." Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The mayor of Atlanta, seated at the VIP table next to Victor Sterling, crossed his arms and looked severely displeased by the unhinged display. But my father was too blinded by his own rage to read the room. He was used to commanding thousands of people who hung onto his every word, and he expected this audience to follow suit. Maya, you have made your choice, my father declared, turning back to face me. He raised the microphone higher. If you refuse to shelter your pregnant sister, you are no longer a daughter of mine, and you are no longer a member of Greater Grace Fellowship. As the senior pastor of that church, I am formally excommunicating you here and now. None of the righteous people in this room will fellowship with you. You are cut off from the grace of our community. David let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. You are excommunicating her from a church she has not attended in 5 years, Marcus. That is not the devastating blow you think it is. My father ignored David entirely, locking his furious gaze onto me. Oh, I am doing much more than that, he threatened, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl amplified by the microphone. You think you are so smart, Maya. You think that little financial advising job of yours makes you untouchable. You seem to forget who I am in this city. I sit on the advisory boards of 3 major banks in Atlanta. I golf with the chief executive officers of every major investment firm in Fulton County. He stepped closer, leveling the microphone like a weapon. By tomorrow morning, I will make 5 phone calls. I will tell my network exactly what kind of character you possess. I will tell them you are unstable, selfish, and entirely untrustworthy. I will personally ensure that you are blacklisted from the financial sector of Atlanta. You will not be able to get a job balancing checkbooks at a local pawn shop by the time I am finished with you. You will be ruined, Maya. You will be begging me for a job in the church administration office just to pay for your groceries. Chloe dropped her hands from her face entirely, her tears miraculously evaporating. A cruel, triumphant smirk spread across her face. She leaned against our mother, crossing her arms. You should have just given me the keys, Maya, she taunted loudly. Now you are going to lose your job and your apartment anyway. You always have to do things the hard way just to prove a point. You are going to be completely broke. Sarah, who had been silently watching the spectacle from the family table, suddenly found her courage again. She stood up and nodded her agreement. Your father is right, Maya. Actions have consequences. You cannot disrespect the patriarch of this family and expect to keep your little corporate privileges. You should apologize and hand over the lease before he ruins your entire career. The sheer delusion of their threats was almost intoxicating. They were threatening to destroy a career I did not even have. They were threatening to blacklist a lowly financial advisor who had actually died years ago and been reborn as a venture capitalist shark. My father thought his Sunday golfing buddies gave him the power to crush me. He had absolutely no idea that his golfing buddies were actually my subordinate managing directors. I looked around the room, locking eyes with the mayor, then with the church deacons, and finally with Victor Sterling. Victor was leaning forward in his chair, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. His dark eyes were alight with brutal anticipation. He gave me a slow, barely perceptible nod. It was the signal. The defense rests. The prosecution was now taking the floor. I reached out and took the microphone from the tight grip of my father. I pulled it from his hand with a sudden forceful jerk that left him stumbling slightly forward. I stepped into the center of the dance floor, positioning myself directly beneath the brilliant crystal chandelier. I was not the disgraced daughter shrinking under the wrath of an abusive patriarch. I was the absolute master of my domain, and it was time to drop the guillotine. Is that the extent of your wrath, Marcus? I asked, my voice echoing through the ballroom with absolute crystal clarity. Are you quite finished threatening my livelihood to subsidize the lies of your golden child? Because if you are done playing the righteous victim, I have a few public announcements of my own to make. And unlike your empty threats, my words actually carry legal weight. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against the chests of everyone present. My father stared at his empty hand where the microphone had been just a second prior. He was entirely unaccustomed to having his power stripped from him so publicly. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The great Pastor Marcus was suddenly robbed of his pulpit. But it was not my father who broke the heavy silence. It was my mother. Diane could not tolerate the sight of me holding the floor with such authority. For decades, she had carefully curated the narrative of our family, portraying herself as the long-suffering matriarch, holding together a flock of imperfect but devoted children. Seeing me stand there completely unbothered by their threats shattered that delusion. She saw the wealthy donors whispering behind their hands. She saw the mayor of Atlanta looking utterly appalled by the sheer lack of class. The pristine reputation she valued above the actual lives of her children was disintegrating before her very eyes. She moved toward me with a sudden erratic energy that abandoned all pretense of church-appropriate grace. Her hands shook with a violent, suppressed fury, making the heavy diamond bracelets on her wrists clatter against each other. She stopped at the edge of the nearest guest table, her eyes darting wildly. She was looking for a weapon to reassert her dominance, to humiliate me back into submission. Her gaze locked onto a nearly full glass of dark vintage Merlot that had been abandoned by a startled guest. Before David or any of the private security personnel lining the walls could react, Diane snatched the wine glass by its delicate crystal stem. She lunged forward, closing the remaining distance between us with terrifying speed. With a sharp, vicious flick of her wrist, she hurled the dark red liquid directly at my chest. The splash was incredibly loud in the dead quiet of the ballroom. The heavy crimson wine struck the bodice of my custom silk wedding gown with brutal force. It splattered against the delicate pearl beadwork, spreading instantly into a jagged, horrific stain that bled down the front of the pristine white fabric. Drops of Merlot dotted my collarbone and stained the edge of my diamond necklace, dripping slowly down my skin. A collective scream of absolute horror erupted from the 500 guests. Several women in the front row leaped out of their chairs, covering their mouths in shock. Even Chloe took a sudden step backward, momentarily terrified by the sheer physical aggression our mother had just displayed. The clatter of overturned chairs echoed as people scrambled away from the blast zone. "You selfish, bitter spinster!" Diane shrieked, her voice entirely stripped of its usual melodic sweetness. The glass slipped from her hand and shattered against the polished hardwood floor, sending shards of crystal flying in every direction. "You think a fancy white dress changes who you really are? You are nothing but an ungrateful, miserable woman who knows absolutely nothing about family. You would rather see your own pregnant sister suffer on the street than share a single drop of your pathetic little life." She pointed a trembling finger at my stained chest, her breathing heavy and ragged with exertion. "You are exactly what I always feared you would be. You are cold. You are barren of any real love. David is going to figure out exactly how empty you are inside, and he will leave you just like Marcus warned you he would. You do not understand family, Maya. You only understand your own petty jealousies. You are dead to me. You hear me. You are absolutely dead to this family." The echo of her screaming faded into the cavernous space of the ballroom, leaving only the sound of her heavy breathing. The guests were frozen, watching with bated breath to see if the bride would finally break. They expected tears. They expected me to flee the room in utter humiliation, hiding my ruined dress and my shattered pride in a bathroom stall. They expected the stereotypical breakdown of a woman who had just been publicly disowned and physically assaulted by her own mother on her wedding day. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I did not even break eye contact with the woman who had just tried to destroy my dignity. I stood perfectly still, letting the cold wine drip slowly down the front of my silk gown. The stark contrast between the violent red stain and the pure white fabric was strangely poetic. It was the physical manifestation of all the toxicity she had poured into my life for 3 decades, finally dragged out into the open for everyone to witness. David moved instantly. He pulled a crisp white linen napkin from the sweetheart table and stepped directly in front of me, shielding me from any further attacks. His eyes were dark with a rage I had never seen in him before. He looked at Diane with a level of disgust that made her physically recoil. "Do not touch her," David said, his voice vibrating with a lethal promise. "If you take one more step toward my wife, I will personally see you handcuffed and dragged out of this venue for assault." I placed a gentle hand on the shoulder of David. I stepped around him, refusing to hide behind my husband. I took the linen napkin from his hand. With slow, deliberate movements, I dabbed at the drops of wine on my collarbone. I wiped the moisture from my necklace. I did not even bother to scrub at the ruined bodice of the dress. The stain did not matter anymore. The dress was just fabric. The real armor I wore was entirely invisible to them. "You are right, Diane," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I do not understand your version of family. I do not understand lying, stealing, and destroying the people you are supposed to protect just to maintain an illusion of grandeur. I do not understand enabling parasites while bleeding your most loyal children dry. If being dead to this family means I no longer have to finance your fake empire, then consider this my formal resignation." I turned my head away from the sputtering, gasping faces of my parents and my sister. I looked across the dance floor, cutting through the sea of horrified guests. My eyes found the VIP table. Victor Sterling was standing now. The billionaire had risen from his chair, his dark eyes fixed entirely on me. He was completely unfazed by the screaming or the thrown wine. He had built his fortune by recognizing the exact moment a hostile negotiation turned into a total war. I looked straight into the eyes of Victor. I gave him a single sharp nod. It was the signal. The time for polite warnings and subtle microaggressions was officially over. The pleasantries of the wedding reception were done. Playtime had concluded. Victor nodded back. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out his cell phone, and typed a rapid sequence of commands to his executive team waiting on standby. The financial guillotine was primed and ready to drop. I turned my attention back to the microphone in my hand, preparing to scorch the earth beneath the feet of my family. I turned my back on the pathetic display of my mother and raised the microphone to my lips. The fabric of my ruined wedding gown clung wetly to my skin, but I no longer felt the cold. I felt only the absolute thrilling heat of total control. I looked past the terrified faces of my family and aimed my voice directly at the elevated sound booth at the back of the grand ballroom. "Lock the doors," I commanded. My voice was no longer the soft, accommodating tone of a financial advisor trying to keep the peace. It was the sharp, undeniable crack of a whip. It was the voice of a woman who liquidated companies before breakfast. "Lock every single exit to this ballroom and cut all ambient lighting immediately." For a fraction of a second, the audiovisual technician hesitated, looking toward Pastor Marcus for confirmation. But the technician was not paid by the church. He was an independent contractor, and I had personally signed his massive retainer check. I stared him down from the dance floor, and his hesitation vanished completely. The response was immediate and theatrical. The heavy oak doors at the back and sides of the ballroom slammed shut simultaneously. The metallic clack of the deadbolts engaging echoed loudly in the cavernous space. Panic rippled through the 500 guests. People shifted nervously in their seats. A few men half rose from their chairs, unsure if they were witnessing a family dispute or a hostage situation. "Sit down," I ordered the command, slicing through the rising murmur. "Nobody is in physical danger today, but nobody is leaving this room until I have finished my presentation. You all came here tonight expecting a show. My mother promised you a spectacle of Christian charity and family devotion. I refuse to let you leave disappointed. You are going to get exactly the show you paid for." The ambient golden uplighting that had given the ballroom its romantic glow snapped off. The room plunged into a brief, disorienting darkness before the stark, brilliant white spotlights blazed to life. The beams angled sharply downward, illuminating me, David, and the stunned figures of my family, like actors trapped on a stage. All the softness of the wedding reception was instantly stripped away. The venue suddenly felt less like a celebration and entirely like a sterile corporate interrogation room. "Drop the screens," I barked into the microphone. Behind the main stage, a loud mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. 3 massive projector screens, each 20 feet wide, began their slow, ominous descent from the vaulted ceiling. The blinding white light from the high-definition projectors hit the blank canvas, casting harsh shadows across the faces of my father and mother. Pastor Marcus finally snapped out of his shock. He lunged forward, his hands grasping at empty air. Maya, have you lost your mind? He bellowed, attempting to use his sheer physical size to intimidate me. Unlock those doors right now. You are holding the mayor of Atlanta against his will. You are going to be arrested for this outrage. I did not even look at him. I gestured casually to the private security guards I had hired. 4 men built like defensive linemen stepped smoothly out of the shadows. They formed an impenetrable human wall between my father and me. Pastor Marcus slammed into the chest of the lead guard and bounced off, stumbling backward into the arms of his terrified golden child. The mayor is not going to arrest me, Marcus, I said, my tone dripping with icy condescension. The mayor is currently sitting at the VIP table with my primary investor. He is watching a masterclass in hostile corporate takeovers, and I assure you he is taking diligent notes. I stepped completely out from behind the sweetheart table. I walked to the very center of the dance floor, the ruined silk of my gown trailing behind me like a battle flag. I stopped pacing. I stopped shrinking. I stood with the aggressive planted stance of a chief executive officer, preparing to deliver a devastating quarterly earnings report to a room full of hostile shareholders. I addressed the 500 faces staring back at me from the darkness. For 33 years, I have been the invisible foundation of this family I began. My voice carried a deadly calm that commanded absolute silence. I have been the scapegoat. I have been the bank. I have been the quiet, compliant daughter who smiled through the insults and funded the illusions. My parents told you I was just a lowly financial worker. They told you I was a bitter spinster who struggled to keep up with the divine blessing showered upon my younger sister. I paused, letting my eyes sweep over the front rows, ensuring every church elder and wealthy donor was hanging on to my every word. They built a kingdom on the narrative that Chloe was the anointed one, while I was the necessary burden. I continued. They sold you a story of pastoral grace and unyielding faith. But every empire built on lies requires a constant stream of actual cash to keep the lights on. And for the last 5 years, I have been the one quietly paying the electric bill. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic scoff from behind the wall of security guards. Do not listen to her, she yelled, her voice grating and shrill. She is making this all up because she is jealous. She just wants attention. She is crazy. I smiled, a slow, lethal upward curve of my lips. I turned my head just enough to look at my sister over my shoulder. I am not making anything up, Chloe, I whispered into the microphone, the sound filling the room with terrifying intimacy. I'm just finally pulling back the curtain. You all demanded my home tonight. You demanded my resources to fund a fake pregnancy and a fake lifestyle. You pushed me into a corner because you thought I was too weak to fight back. I turned back to the crowd, raising my free hand toward the 3 massive blank projector screens hovering behind me. You thought you were bullying a mid-level accountant? I declared, my voice rising into a sharp, authoritative crescendo. You thought you could publicly extort a desperate daughter, but you made a catastrophic miscalculation. You brought a temper tantrum to a corporate execution. This reception is officially over. The annual shareholder meeting of your fake empire is now called to order. Let us review the ledger. I snapped my fingers, pointing directly at the sound booth. The massive center screen flashed from blinding white to a crisp, high-definition display of a corporate organizational chart. The logo of Sterling Capital, a sleek silver crest, dominated the top corner of the slide. Below it, in bold black letters, was a title that sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room: Chief Executive Officer and Majority Shareholder. Beside that title was a high-resolution corporate portrait of my face. I looked fierce, unyielding, and completely devoid of the meekness my family had always forced upon me. I am not a financial advisor, I announced, my voice ringing with undeniable authority. I do not balance checkbooks for local businesses, and I do not max out credit cards to afford a wedding venue. For the past 5 years, I have been the managing partner and primary owner of Sterling Capital. We specialize in the acquisition and aggressive liquidation of distressed assets. We hunt for over-leveraged corporations, bloated vanity projects, and arrogant individuals who borrow millions to maintain a lifestyle they simply cannot afford. When major banks get tired of chasing bad debt, they sell it to me for pennies on the dollar, and I collect. My mother stared at the screen, her jaw practically unhinged. She looked from the towering image of my face on the projection down to the wine-stained bride standing on the dance floor. The cognitive dissonance was visibly breaking her brain. Pastor Marcus gripped the edge of the nearest table, his knuckles turning completely white. He knew exactly what Sterling Capital was. Every wealthy businessman in Atlanta knew that name. We were the apex predators of the financial district. Victor Sterling stood up from the VIP table and walked slowly toward the edge of the dance floor. He did not cross the boundary, but his presence reinforced every single word I spoke. "Maya is being entirely too modest," Victor said, his voice carrying effortlessly without the need for a microphone. "When I met her, she was brilliantly tearing apart a corporate merger that my own senior analysts had fumbled. I did not give her a job. I gave her the keys to the kingdom because she earned them with pure, unmatched brilliance. She owns 60% of the firm. I just lent my name to the door to keep the old boys club comfortable while she quietly bought the ground beneath their feet." I gestured to the audio-visual booth again. The left screen illuminated with a certified financial statement from an elite offshore bank. It was heavily redacted in places to protect proprietary corporate accounts, but the bottom line of my personal liquid assets was highlighted in a brilliant, aggressive green. The number displayed was staggering. It was a massive 8-figure personal net worth. "You spent my entire life calling me a failure." I continued, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the wall of security guards separating me from my stunned family. "You told your church friends I was a struggling spinster who desperately needed your prayers. You told yourselves I was a bitter, lonely woman who envied the pathetic little lives you constructed on credit and lies. But while you were leasing luxury cars to impress your congregation, I was buying the banking institutions that held the titles to those exact cars." Sarah let out a high-pitched whimpering sound, burying her face in her hands. She finally understood the sheer magnitude of her earlier insult. She had offered a petty bridge loan to a woman who could buy her entire bloodline with the casual stroke of a pen. Chloe, on the other hand, looked like a machine malfunctioning. She stared at the 8-figure bank balance on the screen, her eyes wide with a sudden sickening greed. "That is your money?" Chloe asked, her voice cracking as she pushed against the chest of our father to get a better look. "You have all that money, and you let me suffer today. You let me cry over a canceled apartment lease when you could just buy the whole building for me." I laughed, and it was a cold, sharp sound that echoed across the ballroom. "I did not let you suffer, Chloe. I let you live exactly the life you actually earned. You wanted the perks of being an adult without any of the responsibilities. You wanted the heavy crown without ever fighting the brutal war. I built my massive fortune in absolute silence because I knew the second you people smelled cash, you would swarm like desperate locusts to strip me bare." I raised my hand and the right screen flickered to life. It displayed a portfolio summary of commercial real estate holdings across the eastern seaboard. I showed skyscrapers in Charlotte, luxury high-rises in Miami, and sprawling corporate campuses in downtown Atlanta. My portfolio. My personal assets. I looked directly at my mother. Diane was trembling violently now. The terrifying realization that her designated family scapegoat was actually the most powerful person in the room was physically destroying her. "You asked me to be a good Christian woman, Diane," I said, my voice dropping to a conversational yet terrifying level. "You demanded I hand over the keys to a rental unit because you thought I was weak and vulnerable. But the woman standing before you does not rent anything. I own. I own the concrete under your expensive shoes. I own the steel beams holding up this ceiling. I own the very financial air you breathe." David walked up behind me and placed a solid, warm hand on the small of my back. He looked incredibly proud. He had helped me structure the complex legal trusts that kept my name out of the public registry until this exact explosive moment. He knew the sheer amount of discipline it took to sit through agonizing Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas holidays, listening to my family belittle my career, while I secretly managed a billion-dollar venture fund. The guests were completely mesmerized. The wealthy elites in the audience were no longer looking at me with gentle pity or mild amusement. They were looking at me with a mixture of raw fear and profound respect. The invisible daughter was permanently dead. The chief executive officer had finally arrived and she was ready for blood. Victor Sterling stepped onto the dance floor and approached me with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the world. He extended his hand and I passed the microphone to him. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Victor did not look at the crowd. He looked directly at my father, who was practically hyperventilating behind the wall of security guards. "You have a very bad habit of underestimating the women in your life, Marcus," Victor said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "For the past 6 months, you have been calling my private office. You have been leaving desperate voicemails begging my assistance for a grace period. You sat in my lobby sweating through your expensive suits, pleading with me to restructure your massive commercial loans. You swore to me that the church would eventually generate the revenue to cover your catastrophic financial mismanagement." My father opened his mouth to deny it, but his voice completely failed him. The church elders sitting at the front tables began to murmur furiously among themselves. They were the men who supposedly oversaw the church finances, but it was immediately apparent from their shocked expressions that Pastor Marcus had been keeping 2 sets of books. "I do not run a charity." Marcus Victor continued, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "When a borrower misses 3 consecutive payments, I liquidate the asset. But your portfolio was uniquely toxic. It was wrapped in religious exemptions and public relations nightmares that I simply did not want to manage. So I sold your debt. I sold the entire bloated, disastrous package to a firm that specializes in tearing down fake empires and selling off the scrap metal. I sold it to my brilliant chief executive officer." Victor handed the microphone back to me. He gave my father one last look of absolute disgust before stepping back to stand beside David. They stood like twin pillars of support while I prepared to deliver the fatal blow. I raised my free hand and pointed to the audio-visual booth. "Switch to the primary target," I commanded. The 3 massive projector screens behind me flickered. The green numbers of my personal wealth vanished. In their place, a stark, terrifying spreadsheet appeared in glowing white and angry red. The header of the document was impossible to misread. "Greater Grace Fellowship Master Financial Ledger." A collective roar of disbelief erupted from the congregation members seated in the ballroom. Several deacons actually stood up from their chairs, pointing at the screens in horror. The numbers displayed were not a reflection of a thriving spiritual community. They were the autopsy report of a deeply corrupt organization bleeding cash from every single artery. "Let us talk about your legacy, Marcus," I said, my voice slicing through the rising panic of the crowd. 5 years ago, you convinced the church board to authorize a $15 million commercial expansion loan. You told your congregation that the money was for a new community center and a youth education wing. You stood at your pulpit and cried, asking working-class families to tithe extra to fund this divine vision. I paced slowly across the dance floor, my eyes locked on the sweating, trembling figure of my father. But the community center was never built, was it? The youth wing is still a dirt lot enclosed by a chain-link fence. Instead, you used that $15 million to build a 75,000-square-foot luxury pastoral suite. You bought imported Italian marble for your private office. You purchased a fleet of armored sport utility vehicles for your security detail. And as we learned earlier tonight, you diverted the remaining cash to fund the European vacations of your favorite daughter. "Lies," my mother Diane shrieked from the sidelines. Her First Lady persona was completely obliterated. She looked like a cornered animal. "This is a demonic attack on a man of God. You hacked into our systems and forged these documents." David laughed, a sharp, cutting sound. "Those are public records filed with the State Oversight Board, Diane. They are bank-certified statements of default. You cannot pray away a commercial foreclosure." I turned my attention back to the screens. "Look at the red columns, Marcus," I instructed him. "Look at the 90-day past due notices. Look at the 120-day default warnings. You have not made a full mortgage payment on the Greater Grace property in over 6 months. The commercial bank categorized your $15 million loan as an unrecoverable toxic asset. They were preparing to lock the doors of your sanctuary and seize the property. My father grabbed the shoulders of Chloe and pushed her aside, stumbling forward until he hit the chest of my lead security guard. "Maya, please." He begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You cannot show this to these people. This is church business. This is sacred. You are destroying the faith of thousands of innocent people." "I am saving them from a financial predator," I corrected him coldly. "You built a kingdom on the backs of people who trusted you, and you squandered their sacrifices to feed your own massive ego. But the banks do not care about your sermons, Marcus. When you default on $15 million, the bank sells your paper to a collection firm." I stepped right up to the wall of security guards, bringing myself face to face with the man who had just tried to ruin my life. "Sterling Capital bought your paper last week," I whispered into the microphone, making sure every syllable reverberated through the silent ballroom. "We bought your $15 million debt for a fraction of the cost. I own the mortgage to Greater Grace Fellowship. I own the sanctuary where you humiliated me this morning. I own the parking lot. I own the broadcast equipment. I own the imported Italian marble in your private office. I am not just your discarded daughter, Marcus. I am your sole legal creditor." The color completely vanished from his face. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to lean against the security guard to keep from collapsing onto the polished hardwood floor. "And as the chief executive officer of the firm holding your defaulted loan, I am officially terminating your grace period," I announced, my voice ringing with total, absolute victory. "This is your formal verbal notice. Sterling Capital is foreclosing on Greater Grace Fellowship effective immediately. Tomorrow morning, my corporate attorneys will file the paperwork to seize the entire campus. We are changing the locks on your sanctuary. We are freezing the church operating accounts to recover the embezzled funds. Your empire is gone, Marcus. You are bankrupt." The echo of my final word hung in the ballroom like the tolling of a funeral bell. Pastor Marcus collapsed onto his knees. The sheer weight of his financial ruin physically crushed him against the polished hardwood floor. He buried his face in his hands, weeping not in repentance, but in absolute humiliation. The mighty patriarch had fallen. But I was not finished. My corporate execution had a secondary target. I turned my gaze away from the broken pastor and locked eyes with the golden child. Chloe had retreated behind the heavy velvet drapes near the stage, trying to blend into the shadows. The spotlight tracked her movement, pinning her against the wall like a moth under a microscope. Her silver dress sparkled mockingly in the harsh white light. "You look very quiet, Chloe," I said into the microphone. My voice was smooth and lethal. "A few minutes ago, you were eager to share your heartbreaking tragedy with 500 guests. You demanded the keys to my luxury penthouse because you claimed you were a destitute pregnant woman abandoned by a cruel fiancé. You weaponized the sympathy of this entire congregation to steal my home." Chloe clutched her flat stomach. She pushed out her bottom lip, attempting to summon a fresh wave of artificial tears. "You are a monster," she whimpered, her voice shaking. "You are destroying our father, and now you are attacking a vulnerable pregnant woman. My baby is going to be born into the streets because my own sister is a heartless corporate witch." I did not even blink. I lowered the microphone and nodded to my husband. David stepped forward, holding a thick stack of glossy black folders. He walked directly to the VIP tables. He handed the first folder to the mayor of Atlanta. He handed the second folder to the head deacon of Greater Grace Fellowship. He continued moving through the front rows, distributing the dossiers to the most influential gossips and power brokers in the city. "What are you doing?" my mother Diane screamed. She scrambled toward the VIP tables, trying to snatch the folders out of the hands of the church elders. "You cannot hand out private family documents to these people. That is illegal." "There is nothing illegal about distributing the results of a licensed private investigation," David stated clearly. He handed the final folder to Victor Sterling, who opened it with a look of predatory amusement. "When Chloe attempted to extort a multi-million-dollar property from my wife tonight, using a pregnancy as leverage, she committed attempted fraud. I am simply providing the defense exhibits." I raised the microphone back to my lips. "Go ahead and open the folders," I instructed the guests. "Let us review the miraculous, immaculate conception of Chloe." The sound of rustling paper filled the silent ballroom. The mayor adjusted his reading glasses. The head deacon scanned the first page, his jaw dropping open. Page 1, I announced, is a certified medical report from Atlanta General Hospital. It is dated yesterday afternoon. Chloe, you claimed you discovered your pregnancy yesterday morning, but the emergency room intake forms clearly show you went to the hospital yesterday complaining of a minor migraine. They ran a standard blood panel. The human chorionic gonadotropin levels in your blood were absolute zero. You are not pregnant, Chloe. You have never been pregnant. Chloe went rigid. The fake tears instantly dried up, replaced by a look of sheer panicked terror. That is a lie, she shrieked. Those records are fake. You hacked the hospital. Turn to page 2. I commanded the crowd, completely ignoring her frantic denials. Page 2 is a printed receipt from a novelty website specializing in prank gifts. You purchased a fake positive pregnancy test and a customized fake ultrasound image for $49.99. You used the exact same bank account that holds the $50,000 of embezzled church funds to make that purchase. The tracking number shows the package was delivered to your apartment 3 days ago. A collective groan of disgust rippled through the VIP tables. The women from the church choir who had comforted Chloe earlier now looked at her with pure revulsion. Faking a pregnancy in a highly religious community was an unforgivable taboo. It was a grotesque manipulation of their deepest values. You did not just lie to me, Chloe, I said, taking slow, deliberate steps toward her. You lied to 500 people. You stood on this dance floor and invoked the name of God to extort a penthouse apartment based on a $49 plastic prank toy. I am pregnant, she screamed, stamping her foot against the floor like a petulant toddler. Preston left me because he was terrified of being a father. He abandoned his unborn child. Let us talk about Preston. I countered, my voice cutting through her hysterical screaming like a scalpel. Turn to page 3, everyone. Page 3 contains the sworn affidavit from Preston himself. My private investigators tracked him down at his hotel downtown this afternoon. He did not leave you because he was afraid of fatherhood, Chloe. He left you because he discovered the truth about your finances. The ballroom was so quiet, I could hear the harsh, ragged breathing of my mother. Preston works in finance, I explained to the captivated audience. He noticed massive discrepancies in your bank statements. He discovered you were hiding $50,000 of stolen church money. When he confronted you about the embezzlement, you panicked. You tried to trap him by producing a fake positive pregnancy test. You thought a baby would force him to stay and cover up your crimes. But Preston is not a fool. He packed his bags and ran for his life because he realized he was engaged to a sociopathic fraud. Chloe fell to her knees. Her silver dress pooled around her on the floor. She covered her ears with her hands, shaking her head violently back and forth. Stop it, she wailed. Stop saying these things. Make her stop, Mommy. But Diane did not move to comfort her golden child. The First Lady of Greater Grace Fellowship was staring at the printed documents in the hands of the deacons. She saw the absolute disgust on their faces. She realized that the flawless reputation of her precious youngest daughter was completely annihilated. There was no spinning this narrative. There was no praying away a fake ultrasound receipt. You thought you were the smart one, Chloe, I said, looking down at her trembling figure. You thought you could use your manufactured victimhood to steal my home on my wedding night. You thought I would just hand over the keys to avoid a public scene, but you forgot one crucial detail. I analyze fraud for a living. I smell a bad investment from a mile away, and you, Chloe, are the worst investment this family has ever made. The facade of the golden child was completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. Chloe curled into a tight ball on the floor, weeping genuinely for the first time in her entire life. She was not crying for a lost fiancé or a fake baby. She was crying because she had been entirely exposed. The entire congregation now knew she was a lying, manipulative thief who tried to extort her own sister. Her social standing in Atlanta was permanently dead. I turned my attention away from the sobbing mess on the floor. I had one final target remaining. I looked toward the family table where Sarah was still clutching her wine glass. Her eyes were wide with terror as she realized the corporate execution was not quite finished. Sarah tried to push her chair back, but her legs seemed to have forgotten how to function. She was trapped in the blinding glare of the spotlights, her designer gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Marcus Jr. sat frozen beside her, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the carnage I had just unleashed upon our father and sister. He was a coward who had hidden behind the skirts of his wife for years, allowing her to deliver the insults he lacked the spine to vocalize. Now there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. I raised my hand, pointing a single commanding finger at the audio-visual booth. "Bring up the residential portfolio," I ordered. The three massive screens behind me shifted instantly. The scandalous hospital records of Chloe vanished. In their place, a high-resolution aerial photograph of a sprawling modern mansion in Buckhead appeared. It was a stunning property with a pristine infinity pool and a meticulously manicured lawn. Beside the photograph, a heavily redacted legal document was displayed in stark black and white. The header was unmistakable: Notice of default and intent to foreclose. A fresh wave of shocked whispers rolled through the ballroom. The wealthy guests recognized the property immediately. It was the infamous party house where Marcus Jr. and Sarah hosted their elite summer galas and exclusive charity events. It was the physical monument to their supposed generational wealth and their untouchable social status in Atlanta. I walked slowly toward their table, the ruined silk of my wine-stained wedding dress trailing behind me. "Sarah, you came over to my sweetheart table earlier tonight." I began, my voice ringing with absolute chilling clarity. "You offered me a condescending little bridge loan. You told me you pitied my financial struggles. You assumed I was drowning in credit card debt just to afford a few lobster tails. You smiled in my face and insulted my independence, masking your profound racism behind a veil of fake Southern hospitality." Sarah shook her head wildly, tears welling up in her eyes. The classic defense mechanism was activating. She was preparing to deploy her tears to garner sympathy from the room, to paint me as the aggressive, angry black woman attacking the fragile, innocent bystander. "Do not even think about crying." "Sarah," I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip and freezing her tears instantly. "You do not get to play the victim tonight. Look at the screen behind me." Sarah slowly turned her head to look at the massive projection. Marcus Jr. refused to look, keeping his eyes glued to his empty dinner plate as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. "That is a notice of default filed 90 days ago," I explained to the captivated audience. "Marcus Jr. and Sarah have not made a single mortgage payment on their $20 million Buckhead estate in over 8 months. They defaulted on their primary loan. They defaulted on their secondary line of credit. The luxury development project Marcus Jr. mismanaged has completely collapsed under the weight of his sheer incompetence and staggering arrogance." Marcus Jr. finally looked up, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Maya, please do not do this," he pleaded, his voice barely a squeak. "This is private business. We are trying to restructure." "You are not restructuring anything, Marcus," I corrected him coldly. "You are bankrupt. You have been bankrupt for 3 years. You spent your entire trust fund trying to keep up with the billionaires in this room. And when the trust fund ran dry, you started taking out predatory loans to fund your country club memberships and your European sports cars." I stepped right up to the edge of their table, looking down at the two of them. "Sarah, you love to brag about your generational wealth. You love to throw microaggressions at me about being a strong, independent matriarch carrying the burden alone. Let me tell you exactly how heavy that burden has been." I signaled the booth again. The screen shifted to display a series of redacted wire transfers originating from a blind limited liability corporation. "For the last 3 years, I have been the anonymous angel investor keeping your lights on," I revealed. The collective gasp from the room was deafening. "I am the owner of the blind trust that bailed out your failing firm, Marcus. I am the one who quietly paid the arrears on your luxury vehicles so they would not be repossessed in the middle of your country club luncheons. I subsidized your entire fake elite lifestyle because I refused to let your financial stupidity humiliate our family name in the Atlanta business sector." Sarah let out a choked sob, her hands covering her mouth. The realization that her entire life of luxury was a charity handout from the sister-in-law she despised was destroying her completely. The wealthy donors at the nearby tables were looking at her with absolute revulsion. The illusion of her superiority was dead. "You lived in a glass castle funded entirely by my grace," I told her, my voice echoing relentlessly through the ballroom. "And instead of humility, you chose arrogance. You chose to belittle my career. You chose to mock my wedding. You bit the only hand that was keeping you from standing in a soup kitchen line." I turned my back on them and walked to the center of the dance floor, rejoining David and Victor Sterling. I looked back at the screen displaying their foreclosure notice. "Last week, the commercial bank finally moved to seize your property," I announced. "But they did not put it on the open market. They sold the toxic debt package to a venture capital firm. They sold it to Sterling Capital." Marcus Jr. let out a guttural cry of despair, burying his face in his arms. He knew exactly what that meant. "I own the deed to your Buckhead mansion," I declared, my voice ringing with total absolute victory. "I am officially calling in the debt. Your grace period is permanently revoked. Tomorrow morning, my asset recovery team will arrive at your property. You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever fits in the trunk of your leased car and vacate my premises." Sarah fell out of her chair, landing hard on her knees. She reached out toward me, her face streaked with ruined makeup. "Maya, please," she begged, her voice stripped of all its former arrogance. "We have nowhere to go. Please, you cannot do this to us." I looked down at her, feeling nothing but a profound sense of closure. "You should have saved your bridge loan, Sarah," I said coldly. "You are going to need it to pay for the moving truck." The sheer weight of that final sentence crushed whatever defiance remained in Sarah. She collapsed completely onto the floor, sobbing into her ruined designer dress. I turned my attention back to the wider ballroom. The shock that had paralyzed the 500 guests was rapidly dissolving into absolute chaotic frenzy. The heavy silence fractured into a deafening roar of overlapping voices. Wealthy donors were standing up from their chairs, shouting questions at the family table. Church elders were frantically exchanging the glossy black dossiers David had distributed, their faces contorted in righteous fury. I nodded to my lead security guard. He raised a hand, and the rest of the private detail marched forward carrying thick-bound portfolios. They moved methodically through the aisles, dropping the heavy stacks of paper onto the center of every major guest table. The thud of those documents hitting the fine white linen sounded like gavels dropping in a courtroom. "These are not just empty accusations," I announced, my voice slicing cleanly through the rising uproar. "I do not deal in gossip or church rumors. I deal in hard, undeniable facts. I want every single person in this room to open those folders. I want you to read the exact paper trail of this fraudulent family empire. I want you to see the true faces of the people who demand your absolute loyalty and your hard-earned money." Guests scrambled to open the portfolios. Pages rustled frantically as hundreds of eyes scanned the highlighted bank statements, legal deeds, and tax filings. The evidence was irrefutable. For years, Diane and Marcus told this congregation that I was a wayward child. I continued pacing slowly across the dance floor. "They stood at the pulpit and asked for your prayers because I was supposedly drowning in credit card debt and begging them for handouts. They claimed my refusal to attend Sunday service was born of a rebellious, sinful nature. Let us look at the reality." I gestured to the screens behind me. The slides shifted rapidly, displaying a barrage of text messages and voicemails. The dates spanned the entire last decade. "Read the transcripts," I instructed the crowd. "Read the messages where my mother demanded I empty my savings account to pay for the lavish Sweet 16 party of Chloe. Read the emails where Marcus Jr. begged me to secretly cover his offshore gambling debts so his father would not find out. Look at the signed promissory notes where Pastor Marcus himself borrowed heavily from my personal accounts to silence a blackmail threat against his ministry 3 years ago. I was never begging for their charity. I was the silent bank vault they treated like a limitless automated teller machine." My father tried to push himself up from the floor, his face a mask of pure terror. "Maya, please, you cannot release these private records. There are confidentiality clauses. You are violating family trust. You are destroying everything we built." Family trust, I repeated, mocking his desperate plea. You forfeited the concept of trust the moment you stole youth outreach funds to buy luxury handbags. But let us talk about the legal reality of your situation, Marcus. You see, when you sign personal guarantees on commercial loans, you bind your own fate to the sinking ship. David stepped forward, his presence a towering column of legal authority. He adjusted his suit jacket and addressed the room. As managing partner of Sterling Capital, Maya did not just purchase the debt of your church. She purchased the debt holding your primary residence, your luxury vehicles, and your private retirement accounts. Every single asset you possess was used as collateral for the loans you defaulted on. You are boxed into a corner with zero exits. You cannot declare bankruptcy to escape this, because the fraud you committed negates bankruptcy protections under federal law. The head deacon of Greater Grace Fellowship, a stern man who had supported my father for 20 years, suddenly stood up. He threw his copy of the dossier directly at the chest of Pastor Marcus. You stole from the youth. Marcus the deacon roared, his voice shaking with absolute betrayal. You stole from the single mothers who tithed their last dollars to this church. You are an absolute disgrace to the cloth. The ballroom erupted into total pandemonium. Deacons were shouting at my father, demanding immediate resignations. Wealthy political donors, including the mayor and his aides, were aggressively backing away from the family table, pulling out their phones to initiate immediate damage control. They needed to sever all public ties with the fraudulent Pastor Marcus before the morning news cycle caught wind of the scandal. My mother Diane pressed her back against the wall, her eyes darting frantically around the room. She was looking for a single sympathetic face. She was searching for one person who still believed her carefully crafted illusion of the long-suffering First Lady. She found absolutely no one. The women of the church choir who used to hang on to her every word were staring at her with naked disgust. The societal elite she had spent her entire life trying to impress were looking at her as if she were a carrier of a highly contagious disease. You thought you could outsmart me, I said, bringing the microphone back to my lips. My voice was a cold, relentless hammer driving the final nails into their coffins. You thought because I stayed quiet I was weak. You thought because I absorbed your insults I was broken. But I was simply gathering the ammunition. I was quietly stacking the paper trail, tracking the wire transfers, and legally binding you to your own catastrophic greed. I looked down at the shattered remains of my family. Chloe was still curled in a ball, crying over her fake pregnancy and her ruined social life. Sarah was weeping into the stained carpet, mourning her lost mansion. Marcus Jr. was staring blankly at the wall, his mind unable to process his total financial ruin. And my parents, the grand architects of this toxic dynasty, were trembling under the furious glares of the congregation they had swindled. There is no legal loophole out of this, I declared, finalizing their destruction. There is no public relations spin that can save you. The deeds are transferred, the foreclosures are filed, the bank accounts are officially frozen. I have systematically dismantled every single lie you ever told about me, and I have used your own greed to build the steel cage you are currently trapped inside. You are entirely at my mercy, and as we established earlier tonight, I have absolutely none left to ever give you again. The finality of my words hung over the shattered remnants of my family. I handed the microphone back to the audio-visual technician who had stepped down from his booth to watch the destruction up close. He took the device with a look of profound respect. The silence that followed was not the quiet of a stunned audience. It was the deep inhale of a massive crowd preparing to riot. The head deacon, a man named Brother Thomas, who had dedicated 30 years of his life to Greater Grace Fellowship, broke the heavy tension. He bypassed the security guards who parted willingly to let him through. He walked directly up to my father. Pastor Marcus tried to scramble backward, but the heavy oak tables blocked his retreat. You took the building fund, Marcus, Brother Thomas said, his voice shaking with a terrifying righteous anger. My wife and I delayed our retirement for 5 years, so we could tithe more to that specific fund. We believed we were building a sanctuary for the youth of Atlanta. We believed we were doing the work of the Lord. And you took the money of our congregation to buy designer dresses for your spoiled daughter. My father raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Thomas, please, you must understand the pressure I was under. The operational costs were rising. I meant to replace the funds. It was just a temporary loan to my family. A temporary loan! Brother Thomas yelled, the volume of his voice making my mother flinch. You stole from the widows in our congregation. You stole from the single mothers who gave their last $10 on Sunday mornings because you promised them a hundredfold blessing. You are a thief, Marcus. You are a wolf in sheep clothing, and your judgment day has finally arrived. The outrage of Brother Thomas acted as a catalyst for the rest of the ballroom. Hundreds of guests, many of whom were faithful members of the church, began shouting their own accusations. The polite facade of the wedding reception completely vanished. Women who had praised my mother Diane just hours ago were now screaming at her, demanding their donations back. Men in tailored suits were slamming their fists on the tables, shouting about corporate fraud and betrayal. The mayor of Atlanta stood up from the VIP table. He motioned sharply to his security detail. "We are leaving immediately," the mayor instructed his aides. "Contact my press secretary. I want a statement drafted distancing this office from Marcus and Greater Grace Fellowship before midnight. I will not have my administration associated with a criminal embezzlement scandal." My mother Diane reached out toward the departing politicians. "Please do not leave us," she begged, her voice cracking into a desperate shriek. "We are innocent. This is a misunderstanding. We are victims of a cruel corporate setup." Nobody stopped to listen to her lies. The wealthy donors, the politicians, and the social elite of Atlanta swarmed toward the heavy oak doors. They banged on the wood, demanding to be let out. I gave a swift nod to my lead security guard. He signaled his team, and the deadbolts clicked open. The elite guests poured out of the ballroom, fleeing the sinking ship with desperate speed. They wanted to be as far away as possible when the inevitable consequences arrived. However, the church elders and the devoted congregation members did not run. They formed a tight, angry circle around my family. The deacons demanded answers about the $15 million defaulted loan. They demanded to know how long Pastor Marcus had been keeping a second set of financial ledgers. David stepped forward, standing beside Brother Thomas. The anger of the crowd quieted slightly as they looked to my husband, the civil rights attorney who had provided the undeniable evidence of their betrayal. "The financial ruin of this family is already absolute," David announced, addressing the furious congregation. "Sterling Capital has legally secured the debt, and the foreclosure process on the church property is already in motion. However, the theft of the Youth Outreach Fund is an entirely separate matter. That is not a civil dispute over a defaulted mortgage. That is a criminal act of corporate embezzlement and wire fraud." My father looked up at David, his eyes wide with a new creeping terror. "What have you done?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the angry murmurs of the crowd. "I did my civic duty," Marcus David replied coldly. "When I uncovered the wire transfers funneling tax-exempt charity funds into the personal bank accounts of Chloe, I did not just print them out for a wedding reception display. I compiled a comprehensive digital dossier. I included the forged tax documents, the hidden ledgers, and the wire transfer receipts showing exactly how you stole from this congregation to fund luxury shopping trips." David checked his watch, a slow, devastating smile spreading across his face. "And exactly 2 hours ago, right before we walked into this reception, I forwarded that entire encrypted dossier directly to the white-collar crime division of the Atlanta Police Department. I also copied the federal authorities who handle tax-exempt organization fraud." My mother let out a sound that I can only describe as a dying gasp. She grabbed the lapels of my father, shaking him violently. "Marcus, tell him to stop it. Tell him to take it back. We cannot go to prison. I am the First Lady of the church. I cannot go to jail." Chloe began hyperventilating on the floor. Her fake pregnancy forgotten, she was now facing the terrifying reality of federal wire fraud charges for receiving and spending stolen charity funds. Sarah and Marcus Jr. pressed themselves against the back wall, trying to make themselves invisible, hoping the authorities would ignore their own fraudulent loan applications. David looked down at my mother with absolute zero pity. "You cannot take back a federal crime, Diane. The authorities were highly interested in the $50,000. They were even more interested in the sudden disappearance of the $15 million commercial loan. They agreed that an immediate intervention was necessary to prevent any further destruction of evidence. As if summoned by the words of my husband, a new sound cut through the chaos of the ballroom. It started as a faint wail in the distance, but it grew rapidly louder. The shrill, piercing scream of police sirens echoed through the downtown streets, bouncing off the high-rise buildings. The sound multiplied. It was not just one patrol car. It was a coordinated fleet of vehicles converging rapidly on the $5 million event center I had purchased. The red and blue lights began to flash outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the ballroom, casting frantic, sweeping colors across the pale, terrified faces of my family. The congregation members stepped back, clearing a wide, undeniable path from the main entrance directly to the family table. The sirens wailed louder, signaling the absolute end of the fake empire. The reign of Pastor Marcus and First Lady Diane was over. The golden child was about to trade her silver evening gown for a standard-issue jumpsuit. I stood perfectly still, watching the flashing lights illuminate the ballroom, knowing I had finally balanced the ledger. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom pushed open with a loud, undeniable thud. 4 uniformed police officers and 2 detectives stepped into the vestibule. They stood quietly by the entrance, surveying the chaotic scene, waiting for the crowd to clear a safe path. Their presence was a silent, ticking clock counting down the final seconds of my father holding his freedom. When Pastor Marcus saw the silver badges glinting under the emergency lights, his last shred of dignity completely evaporated. The realization that his public humiliation was about to become a criminal arrest broke him. He scrambled forward on the polished hardwood floor. He did not walk. He crawled. The man who spent 3 decades demanding unwavering respect dragged himself across the dance floor on his hands and knees. He stopped right at the hem of my ruined silk wedding gown. He looked up at me, and his face was entirely unrecognizable. It was stripped of the arrogance, the religious authority, and the paternal superiority. It was just the face of a terrified man facing the consequences of unchecked greed. "Maya, please," he begged. His voice was a wretched, wet sob, echoing pathetically through the microphone, still humming softly in the hands of David. "I am your father. I gave you life. You cannot let them put me in handcuffs. You cannot let them take me away like a common criminal." I looked down at him. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no residual daughterly affection. I felt like a surgeon observing a necrotic organ that had finally been successfully excised from a healthy body. "You are not a common criminal, Marcus," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Common criminals steal bread to feed their starving children. You stole from starving children to feed your own massive ego. There is a very distinct difference." My father reached out, attempting to grab the fabric of my dress, but Victor Sterling took a sudden, threatening step forward. My father flinched and pulled his hands back, pressing them against his own chest. He resorted to the only weapon he had left. He tried to weaponize the very concept of family that he had spent my entire life destroying. "We are family." "Maya." My father wept. "Blood is thicker than water. The Bible teaches us about grace and forgiveness. I know I failed you. I know I was blind to your pain, but you are a Christian woman. You cannot condemn your own flesh and blood to a prison cell. I just need time. Give me a grace period on the defaulted loan. Give me 30 days to liquidate my personal assets and repay the Youth Outreach Fund. You have the power to stop this. You can tell the detectives it was a private corporate dispute. You can save this family." My mother, Diane, rushed forward, dropping to her knees right beside him. Her expensive updo was completely unraveled, her mascara running in dark, ugly rivers down her cheeks. She clasped her hands together in a desperate posture of prayer. "Please," Maya Diane wailed, her voice cracking under the strain of her panic. "Think of the shame this will bring upon our name. Think of the legacy. I will do whatever you want. I will publicly apologize to you every Sunday for the rest of my life. Just call off the police. Just give us a chance to make it right. You are my daughter. You are my brilliant, successful daughter, and I am so incredibly proud of you." The sheer transparency of her sudden pride was almost laughable. She was proud of my bank account. She was proud of my ability to halt a federal investigation. She was not proud of me. Chloe remained on the floor a few feet away, too paralyzed by the sight of the police officers to even join the groveling. She just rocked back and forth, muttering to herself about how this was all a terrible nightmare she was going to wake up from. I looked at the pathetic, weeping figures of my parents kneeling before me. I thought about the little girl who had spent years trying to earn a single scrap of their genuine affection. I thought about the teenager who had paid her own way through college while they bought designer luggage for Chloe. I thought about the bride who had stood alone in the vestibule just a few hours ago, begging her father to walk her down the aisle. I leaned down slightly, closing the physical distance between my face and the tear-soaked face of my father. I made sure my voice was loud enough for the approaching detectives to hear every single word clearly. "You want to invoke the sacred bond of family now, Marcus?" I asked. My tone was a freezing, lethal whisper that cut straight through his sobbing. "You want to talk about blood and grace when the federal authorities are standing in your lobby?" He nodded frantically, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope. "Yes, Maya, please. We are family." I straightened my posture, looking down at him with absolute finality. I delivered the verdict. "You chose your family when you walked her down my aisle," I declared, my voice ringing with brutal, absolute truth. "You made your choice when you abandoned me at the threshold of this church to comfort a woman who was crying over a fake pregnancy. You made your choice when you stole $15 million and tried to extort my home to cover your tracks. I am not your daughter anymore, Marcus. I am just a venture capitalist foreclosing on a series of exceptionally bad investments." I turned my back on them. I did not want to watch the detective snap the cold metal handcuffs around his wrists. I did not want to see my mother screaming as a female officer read her Miranda rights. I had delivered my justice, and the transaction was officially complete forever. I walked away from the chaos unfolding on the dance floor with a steady, measured pace. The sound of metal clicking into place and the frantic, desperate sobbing of my mother faded into the background. I did not look back. Not even once. The urge to check on them, to offer a small sliver of comfort, was a ghost of a girl who no longer existed. I had spent 33 years looking back, making sure they were comfortable while they eagerly pushed me into the dirt. That cycle was permanently broken. David was waiting for me at the edge of the stage. His dark eyes were filled with a profound, protective pride. He extended his arm toward me, his stance as solid and unwavering as the love he had shown me since the day we met. I slid my arm through his, feeling the warm, reassuring weight of a true partnership. We did not need to speak. The silent communication between us was absolute. We had weathered the storm together, and we had emerged completely untouched by the wreckage. Victor Sterling stepped up beside us. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, brushing away an imaginary speck of dust. He looked entirely satisfied, like a predator who had just finished a highly successful hunt. He offered me his arm on my other side. I accepted it, linking myself between the two most powerful, loyal men in my life. One was my husband and my fiercest advocate. The other was my mentor and my greatest ally. They were the family I had chosen. They were the family who had actually earned their place beside me. I raised my head and locked eyes with the audiovisual technician, who was still standing by his booth watching the arrests with wide eyes. "Hit the track," I commanded, my voice echoing clearly over the commotion. The technician scrambled back to his soundboard. A second later, the heavy pulsing rhythm of an upbeat brass-heavy jazz track blasted through the premium speakers of the ballroom. The energetic, triumphant horns completely drowned out the whining of Chloe and the legal protests of Marcus Jr. The music swelled, filling the massive space with a vibrant, unapologetic celebration of victory. It was the perfect soundtrack for a highly successful corporate departure. We began to walk. David, Victor, and I moved in perfect synchronization. We strode down the center of the ballroom, navigating through the overturned chairs and the discarded black dossiers. The remaining guests parted for us like the Red Sea. They pressed themselves against the walls, watching us with a mixture of awe and absolute reverence. Nobody dared to speak to us, Nobody dared to offer empty platitudes or fake sympathy. They simply watched the true power in the room make its final, definitive exit. We walked past the shattered glass of the Merlot my mother had thrown. We walked past the towering centerpieces of white orchids I had paid for. We walked straight out of the heavy oak doors and into the cool, crisp air of the Atlanta night. The red and blue lights of the police cruisers were still flashing wildly against the exterior of the event center, painting the concrete in chaotic strokes of color. But the chaos belonged entirely to them now. It was no longer my burden to carry. For generations, women who look like me have been told that our greatest virtue is our capacity to endure pain. We are taught to be the strong Black woman. We are expected to carry the financial, emotional, and spiritual debts of our families without a single word of complaint. We are conditioned to believe that our sacrifice is the rent we pay for our existence. We are told to forgive the unforgivable because blood is supposedly thicker than water. But blood is not a binding contract. Blood is just a biological coincidence. Loyalty is a choice. Respect is a currency. And love is an investment that must yield a mutual return. I refuse to let my family bankrupt my spirit any longer. I refuse to let their toxic demands hollow out my future. I took the concept of the strong Black woman and I aggressively restructured it. I stopped carrying their burdens and I started building my own empire. My father thought his title and his pulpit gave him the ultimate authority over my life. He believed he could command respect while offering absolutely nothing in return. My mother thought her performative righteousness could mask her profound cruelty. Chloe thought her manufactured tears were a universal currency that could buy her whatever she desired. They all played their roles perfectly in a completely flawed system, but they failed to realize that I had quietly purchased the entire board they were playing on. I stepped onto the sidewalk, taking a deep breath of the fresh night air. The heavy scent of jasmine and city rain filled my lungs. The stain of the red wine on my wedding dress was drying, but I wore it like a badge of honor. It was the visual proof that I had survived the absolute worst they could throw at me, and I had still won the war. Victor turned to me and gave me a rare, genuine smile. "I will see you at the office on Monday morning, Maya," he said, releasing my arm and stepping toward his waiting town car. "We have a church to liquidate." I smiled back at him. "I will be there early." "Victor," I replied, "we have a lot of new assets to restructure." Victor climbed into his car, and the dark-tinted windows rolled up, hiding him from the flashing police lights. David pulled me close, wrapping both of his arms securely around my waist. He kissed my forehead, lingering there for a long, comforting moment. "You did it, Mrs. Sterling," he murmured into my skin. "You actually burned it all down." I rested my head against the solid warmth of his chest, looking back at the magnificent event center I now owned. The police officers were marching my father out of the front doors in handcuffs. My mother trailed behind him, sobbing wildly as a detective guided her toward a squad car. Their fake empire was officially reduced to ashes, and I held the only match. "I did not burn it down, David," I corrected him softly. "I just turned on the lights and let them incinerate themselves." We walked toward our own waiting car, leaving the flashing lights and the screaming sirens far behind us. I did not offer them forgiveness. I did not offer them a second chance. I offered them exactly what they had earned. The invisible daughter was gone forever. The Queen of Atlanta had officially taken her throne, and she was never stepping down again. As the driver opened the door of our luxury sedan, I paused for a single moment to take in the full scope of my freedom. The city skyline of Atlanta loomed in the distance, a jagged silhouette of glass and steel. Those buildings represented power, money, and undeniable influence. I used to look at that skyline from the window of my tiny college dorm room, wondering if I would ever carve out a space for myself in a world that seemed determined to keep me at the very bottom. Now I owned a significant portion of that skyline. My family had tried to convince me that my worth was tied to my utility. If I was not useful to them, I was useless to the world. They wanted me to believe that a woman without their approval was destined to fail. But I had proven that true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the validation of toxic relatives. True wealth is the unshakable knowledge of your own value. It is the terrifying, liberating realization that you do not need permission to be extraordinary. I slid into the back seat of the car, the soft leather, a stark contrast to the hard, cold reality my parents were currently facing in the back of a police cruiser. David slid in right beside me, taking my hand and resting it firmly on his thigh. The driver closed the door, shutting out the noise of the sirens and the chaotic aftermath of the reception. The interior of the car was a silent, peaceful sanctuary. "We are going to our home now," David said, squeezing my hand. "The real one. The one nobody can ever threaten or try to take from you again." I leaned my head back against the plush headrest. I thought about the luxury downtown penthouse that Chloe had demanded. I thought about the massive portfolio of distressed debt sitting in the secure servers of my firm. I thought about the future David and I were going to build entirely free from the parasitic drain of my biological family. We were going to build real generational wealth. We were going to build a family rooted in actual love, unwavering loyalty, and absolute mutual respect. "Drive," I told the chauffeur. The car pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the late-night traffic of the city. I watched the event center disappear from the rearview mirror. I did not shed a single tear for the family I had just destroyed. They had made their choices, and I had simply delivered the invoice. I was stepping into my future completely unburdened, completely victorious, and completely free. The debt was finally settled. The most profound lesson from this narrative is that shared DNA does not guarantee unconditional love or loyalty. For years, the protagonist endured emotional abuse and financial exploitation to maintain a toxic family facade. However, her journey reveals that true empowerment comes from setting unbreakable boundaries. We often diminish our own light to keep others comfortable, but real strength lies in recognizing your self-worth and refusing to finance your own disrespect. You cannot heal in the very environment that broke you. Stop pouring your energy into relationships that only drain you and start investing in your own peace today.